Chapter 21 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It seemed patent to Bill Sanderson earlier that afternoon that fate had stacked the cards against Riley Sinclair. Bill Sanderson, indeed, believed in fate. He felt that great hidden forces had always controlled his life, moving him hither and yon according to their pleasure. To the dreamy mind of the mystic, men are accidents, and all they perform are the dictates of the power and the brain of the other world. Sanderson could tell at what definite moments hunches had seized him. He had looked at the side of the mountain and suddenly felt, without any reason or volition on his part, that he was impelled to search that mountainside for gold-bearing ore. He had never fallen into the habit of using his reason. He was a wonderful gambler, playing with singular abandon and usually winning. It mattered not what he held in his hand. If the urge came to him, and the surety that he was going to bet, he would wager everything in his wallet, all that he could borrow, on a pair of trays. And when such a fit was on him, the overwhelming confidence that shone in his face usually overpowered the other men sitting in at the game. More than once a full house had been laid down to his wretched pair. There were other occasions when he had lost the very boots he wore, but the times of winning naturally overbalanced the losses in the mind of Bill. It was not he had won. It was not he who lost. It was fate which ruled him, and that fate, he felt at present, had sided against Riley Sinclair. A sort of pity for the big cowpuncher had moved him. He knew that he and Quade and Lowry deserved death in its most terrible form for their betrayal of Hal Sinclair in the desert, and nothing but fate, he was sure, could save him from the Avenger. Fate, however, had definitely intervened. What save-blind fate could have stepped into the mind of Sinclair and made him keep cold feet from the rope when that hanging would have removed forever all suspicion that Sinclair himself had killed Quade? Another man would have attributed both of those actions to common decency in Sinclair, but Sanderson always hunted out more profound reasons. In order to let the fact of his own salvation from Sinclair's gun sink more definitely into his brain, he trotted his horse into the hills that afternoon. When he came back, he heard that the posse was in town. To another, it might have seemed odd that the posse was there instead of on the trail of the outlaws. But Sanderson had never thought so practical a question. To him, it was as clear as day. The posse had been brought to Sour Creek by fate in order that he, Sanderson, might enlist in its ranks and help in the great work of running down Sinclair, for, after all, it was work primarily to his own interest. There was something ironically absurd about it. He, Sanderson, having committed the mortal crime of abandoning Hal Sinclair in the desert, was now given the support of legal society to destroy the just avenger of that original crime. It was hardly any wonder that Sanderson saw in all this the hand of fate. He went straight to the hotel and up to the room which the sheriff had engaged. Cartwright was coming out with a black face as Sanderson entered. The former turned at the door and faced Kern and the four assistants of the sheriff. "I'll tell you what you do, you wise gents," he growled. "You'll miss him altogether, you hear?" And then he stamped down the hall. Sanderson carefully removed his hat as he went in. He was quite aware that Cartwright must have just been refused a place on the posse, and he did not wish to appear too confident. He paid his compliments to the bunch, except Arizona, to whom he was introduced. The sheriff forestalled his request. "You've come for a job in the posse, Bill?" Hastily Sanderson cut in, before the others should pronounce a final judgment. "I don't blame you for turning down Cartwright," he said. "A gent like that, who don't know the country, ain't much use on the trail, eh?" "The point is, Bill, I got all the men I need. I don't want a whole gang." "But I got a special reason, sheriff. Besides a tolerable fast horse that might come in handy for a chase, I sling a tolerable fast gun, sheriff. But beyond that all, I got a grudge." "A grudge?" asked the sheriff, pricking his ears. "So did Cartwright have a grudge," cut in Arizona dryly. Perhaps, after all, Sandersen felt, fate might not be with him in this quest for Sinclair. He said earnestly, "You see, boys, it was me that raised the posse that run down Cold Feet in the first place. It was me that backed up Sinclair all the way through the trial. And I feel like some sort of the blame for what happened is coming to me. I want to square things up and get a chance at Sinclair. I want it mighty bad. You know me, Kern. Give me a chance, will you?" "Well, that sounds like reason," admitted the sheriff. "Huh, boys?" The posse nodded its general head, with the usual exception of Arizona, who seemed to take a particular pleasure in diverging from the judgments of the others. "Just a minute, gents," he said. "Don't it strike you that there's something the same with Cartwright and Sandersen? Both of 'em in particular anxious to cut in on this party. Both of 'em has grudges. Cartwright said he didn't want no share of the money if he caught Gaspar and Sinclair. Is that right for you too, Sandersen?" "It sure is. I want the fun, not the coin," said Sandersen. "Boys," resumed Arizona, "it rounds up to this. Sinclair came down here to Sour Creek for a purpose." Sandersen began to listen intently. He even dreaded this fat man from the Southland. "I don't know what this purpose was," went on Arizona, "but mostly when a gent like Sinclair makes a trip, they's a man at the far end of it, because this ain't his range. Now, if it's a man, why shouldn't it be one of these two, Cartwright or Sandersen, who both pack grudges against Sinclair? Sinclair's resting somewhere up yonder in them hills. I'm sure of that. He's waiting there to get a chance to finish his business in Sour Creek. And that business is Cartwright or Sandersen. I don't know which. But I'm again taking in Sandersen. When we're private, I'll tell you my reason why." There was something of an insult in this speech, and the tall man took instant offense. "Partner," he drawled, "it looks to me like them reasons could be spoke personal to me. Suppose you step outside and we talk shop." Arizona smiled. It took a man of some courage and standing to refuse such an invitation without losing caste. But for some reason Arizona was the last man in the world whom one could accuse of being a coward. "Sandersen," he said coldly, "I don't mean to step on your toes. You may be as good a man as the next. The reasons I got against you ain't personal whatever, which they're things I've got a right to think, me a being an officer of the law for the time being. If you hold a grudge against me for what I've said, you and me can talk it over after this here job's done. Is that square?" "I suppose it's got to be," replied Sandersen. "Gents, does the word of your fat friend go here?" Left to themselves, the posse probably would have refused Arizona's advice on general principles. But Arizona did not leave them to themselves. "Sure my word goes," he hastened to put in. "The sheriff and all of us work like a closed hand, all together." There was a subtle flattery about this that pleased the sheriff and the others. "Reckoning it all in all," said the sheriff, "I think we'd better figure you out, Sandersen. Besides, there ain't anything to keep you and Cartwright and the rest from rigging up a little posse of your own. Sinclair is up yonder in the hills waiting." Suddenly he stopped. Sandersen was shaken as if by a violent ague, and his face lost all color becoming a sickly white. "And we're going to find him by ourselves. So long, Sanderson, and thanks for dropping in. No hard feelings, mind." To this friendly dismissal, Sanderson returned no answer. He turned away with a wide staring eye and went through the doorway like a man walking in a dream. Arizona was instantly on his feet. "You see, boys," he asked exultantly, "I was right. When you said Sinclair was waiting up in the hills, Sanderson was scared. I was right. He's one of them that Sinclair is after, and that's why he wanted to throw in with us." "And why the devil shouldn't he?" asked the sheriff. "For a good reason, Sheriff. Reason that'll save us a pile of riding. We'll sit tight here in Sour Creek for a while and catch Sinclair right here. Do you know how? By watching Cartwright and Sanderson. As sure as there's a sky over us, Sinclair is going to make a try at one of 'em. They both hate him. Well, you can lay to it that he hates 'em back. And a man that Sinclair hates, he's going to get sooner or later, chiefly sooner. Sheriff, keep an eye on them two tonight, and you'll have Sinclair playing right into your hands." "Looks to me," muttered Red Chalmers, "like you had a grudge against Cartwright and Sanderson, using them for live bait and us for a trap." "Why not?" asked Arizona, sitting down and rubbing his fat hands, much pleased with himself. "Why not, I'd like to know?" In the meantime, Bill Sanderson had gone down to the street, still with the staring eyes of a sleepwalker. It was evening, and from the open street he looked out and up to the mountains, growing blue and purple against the sky. He had heard Hal Sinclair talk about Riley and Riley's love for the higher mountains. They were his country, and a great surety dropped upon him that the fat man of the posse had been right. Somewhere in those mountains Sinclair was lurking, ready for a descent upon Sour Creek. Now Sanderson grew cold. All that was superstitious in his nature took him by the throat. The fate which he had felt to be fighting with him, he now was equally sure was aligned against him. Otherwise, why had the posse refused to accept him as a member? For only one reason. He was doomed to die by the hand of Riley Sinclair, and then, no doubt, Riley Sinclair would fall in turn by the bullets of the posse. The shadows were pouring out of the gorges of the western mountains, and night began to invade the hollow of Sour Creek. Every downward step of those shadows was to the feverish imagination of Sanderson a forecast of the coming of Sinclair. Sinclair coming in spite of the posse, in spite of the price upon his head. In the few moments during which Sanderson remained in the street watching, the tumult grew in his mind. He was afraid. He was mortally in terror of something more than physical death, and, like the cornered rat, he felt a sudden urge to go out and meet the danger halfway. A dozen pictures came to him of Sinclair slipping into town under cover of the night, of the stealthy approach, of the gunplay that would follow. Why not take the desperate chance of going out to find the assailant and take him by surprise instead? The mountains, that was the country of Sinclair. Instinctively, his eyes fell and clung to the greatest height he could see, a flat-topped mountain due west of Sour Creek. Sanderson swung into his saddle and drove out of Sour Creek toward the goal and into the deepening gloom of the evening. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the darkness beneath the north windows of the hotel, Sinclair consulted his watch, holding it close until he could make out the dim position of the hands against the white dial. It was too early for Cartwright to be in bed, unless he were a very long sleeper. so Sinclair waited. A continual danger lay beside him. The kitchen door constantly banged open and shut as the Chinese cook trotted out and back, carrying scraps to the waste barrel or bringing his new washing tins to hang on a rack in the open air, a resource on which he was forced to fall back on account of his cramped quarters. But the cook never left the bright shaft of light which fell through the doorway behind and above him, and consequently he could not see into the thick darkness where Sinclair crouched only a few yards away, and the cowpuncher remained moveless. From time to time he looked up, and still the windows were black. After what seemed an eternity, there was a flicker as when the wick of a lamp is lighted, and then a steady glow as the chimney was put on again. The glow brightened, decreased, became an unchanging light. The wick had been trimmed, and Cartwright was in for the evening. However, the cook had not ceased his pilgrimages. At the very moment when Sinclair had straightened to attempt to climb up the side of the house, the cook came out and crouched on the upper step, humming a jangling tune and sucking audibly on a long-stemmed pipe. The queer-smelling smoke drifted across to Sinclair. For a moment he was on the verge of attempting a quick leap and a tying and gagging of the Oriental, but he desisted. Instead, Sinclair flattened himself against the wall and waited. Providence came to his assistance at the crisis. Someone called from the interior of the house. There was an odd-sounding exclamation from the cook, and then the latter jumped up and scurried inside, slamming the screen door behind him with a great racket. Sinclair raised his head and surveyed the side of the wall for the last time. The sill of the window of the first floor was no higher than his shoulders. The eaves above that window projected well out, and they would afford an excellent hold by which he could swing himself up. But having swung up, the great problem was to obtain sufficient purchase for his knees to keep from sliding off before he had a chance to steady himself. Once on the ledge of those eaves, he could stand up and look through any one of the three windows into the room which, according to the boy, Cartwright occupied. He lifted himself onto the sill of the first window, bumping his nose sharply against the pane of the glass. Then began the more difficult task. He straightened and fixed his fingers firmly on the ledge above him, waiting until his palm and the fingertips had sweated into a steady grip. Then he stepped as far as possible to one side and sprang up with a great heave of the shoulders. But the effort was too great. He not only flung himself up far enough, but too far, and his descending knee, striving for a hold, slipped off as if from an oiled surface. He came down with a jar, the full length of his arms, a fall that flung him down on his back on the ground. With a stifled curse, he leaped up again. It seemed that the noise of that fall must have resounded for a great distance. But as he stood there listening, no one drew near. Someone came out of the front door of the hotel, laughing. The cowpuncher tried again. He managed the first stage of the ascent, as before, very easily. But making the second effort, he exceeded too much in caution and fell short. However, the fall did not include a toppling all the way to the ground. His feet landed softly on the sill, and at the same time voices turned the corner of the building beside him. Sinclair flattened himself against the pane of the lower window and held his breath. Two men were beneath him. Their heads were level with his feet. He could have kicked the hats off their heads without the slightest trouble. It was a mystery that they did not see him, he thought, until he recalled that all men at night naturally face outward from a wall. It is an instinct. They stood close together, talking rather low. The one was fairly tall, and the other squat. The shorter man lighted a cigarette. The matchlight glinted on an oily olive skin, and so much of the profile as he could see was faintly familiar. He sent his memory lurching back into far places in old times, but he had no nerve for reminiscence. He recalled himself to the danger of the moment and listened to them talking. "What's happened?" the taller man was saying. "So far, nothing," grunted the other. "And how long do you feel we ought to keep it up?" "I don't know. I'll tell you when I get tired." "Speaking personal, Fatty, I'm kind of tired of it right now. I want to hit the hay." Buck up, partner. We'll get 'em yet." Now it flashed into the mind of Sinclair that it must be a pair of crooked gamblers working on some fat purse in the hotel, come out here to arrange plans because they failed to extract the bankroll as quickly as they desired. Otherwise, there could be no meaning to this talk of getting someone. "But between you and me," grumbled the big man, "it looked from the first like a bum game, Fatty." "That's the trouble with you, Red. You ain't got any patience. How does a cat catch a mouse? By sitting down and waiting, maybe 3 hours. And the hungrier she gets, the longer she'll wait and the stiller she'll sit. A man can take a good lesson out of that." "You always got a pile of fancy words," protested the big man. Sinclair saw Fatty put his hand on the shoulder of his companion. Plainly, he was the dominant force of the two, in spite of his lack of height. "Red, as sure as you're born, there's something going to happen this here night. My scars is itching, Red, and that means something." Again the mind of Sinclair flashed back to something familiar, a man who prophesied by the itching of his scars. But once more the danger of the moment made his mind a blank to all else. "What scars?" asked Red. "Scratches I got when I was a kid," flashed the fat man, "that's all." "Oh," chuckled Red, plainly unconvinced. "Well, we'll play the game a little longer." "That's the talk, partner. I tell you we got this trap baited, and it's got to catch." Presently they drifted around the corner of the building and out of sight. For a moment Sinclair wondered what the trap could be which the fat man had baited so carefully. His mind reverted to his original picture of a card game. Cheap tricksters, sharpers with the cards, he decided, and with that decision he banished them both from his mind. There was no other sign of life around him. All of Sour Creek lived at the main street, or went to bed at this hour of the early night. The back of the hotel was safe from observance, except for the horse shed, and the back of the shed was turned to him. He felt safe, and now he turned, settled his fingers into a new grip on the eaves, and made his third attempt. It succeeded to a nicety, his right knee catching solidly on the ledge. He got a fingertip hold on the boards and stood up. Straightening himself slowly, he looked into the room through a corner of the window pane. Cartwright sat with his back to the window, a lamp beside him on the table, writing. He had thrown off his heavy outer shirt, and he wore only a cotton undershirt. His heavy shoulders and big muscled arms showed to great advantage, with the light and sharp shadows defining each ridge. Now and then he lifted his head to think. Then he bent to his writing again. It occurred to Sinclair to fling the window up boldly, and when Cartwright turned, cover him with a gun. But the chances, including his position on the ledge, were very much against him. Cartwright would probably snatch at his own gun, which lay before him in its holster on the table, and whirling, he would try a snap shot. The only other alternative was to raise the window, and that with Cartwright 4 paces away. First Sinclair took stock of the interior of the room. It was larger than most parlors he had seen. There was a big double bed on each side of it. Plainly, it was intended to accommodate a whole party, and Sinclair smiled at the vanity of the man who had insisted on taking the best you have. No wonder Sour Creek knew the room he had rented. In the corner was a great fireplace capable of taking a 6-foot log at least. He admired the massive andirons, palpably of home manufacture in Sour Creek's blacksmith shop. It proved the age of the building. No one would waste money on such a fireplace in these days. A little stove would do twice the work of that great, hungry chimney. There were 2 great chests of drawers, also, each looking as if it were built up from the floor and made immovable, such was its weight. The beds, also, were of an ancient and solid school of furniture making. To be sure, everything was sadly run down. On the floor, the thin old carpet was worn completely through at the sides of the beds. Both mirrors above the chest of drawers were sadly cracked, and the table at which Cartwright sat leaned to the right under the weight of the arm he rested on it. Having thus taken in the details of the battleground, Sinclair made ready for the attack. He made sure of his footing on the ledge, gave a last glance over his shoulder to see that no one was in sight, and then began to work at the window, moving it fractions of an inch at a time. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When the window was half raised, the work of a full 10 minutes, Sinclair drew his revolver and rested the barrel on the sill. He continued to lift the sash, but now he used his left hand alone, and thereby the noises became louder and more frequent. Cartwright occasionally raised his head, but probably he was becoming accustomed to the sounds. Now the window was raised to its full height, and Sinclair prepared for the command which would jerk Cartwright's hands above his head and make him turn slowly to look into the mouth of the gun. Weight, which he could have easily handled with a lurch, became tenfold heavier with the slowness of the lift. Eventually both shoulders were in the room, and he was kneeling on the sill. Cartwright raised his hands slowly, luxuriously, and stretched. It was a movement so opportune that Sinclair almost laughed aloud. He twisted his legs over the sill and dropped lightly on the floor. "No noise," he called softly. The arms of Cartwright became frozen in their position above his head. He turned slowly, with little jerky movements, as though he had to fight to make himself look. And then he saw Sinclair. "Keep 'em up," commanded the cowpuncher, "and get out of that chair, real soft and slow. That's it." Without a word, Cartwright obeyed. There was no need of speech, indeed, for a score of expressions flashed into his face. "Go over and lock the door." He obeyed, keeping his arms above his head, all the way across the room, while Sinclair jerked the new Colt out of its holster and tossed it on the farthest bed. In the meantime, Cartwright lingered at the door for a moment, with his hand on the key. No doubt he fought for the split part of a second, with a wild temptation to jerk that door open and leap into the safety of the hall. Sinclair read the thought in the tremor of the big man's body, but presently discretion prevailed. Cartwright turned the key and faced about. He was deadly gray, and his lips were working. "Now," he began. "Wait till I start talking," urged Sinclair. "Come over here and sit down. You're too close to the door to suit me just now. This is a pile better." Cartwright obeyed quietly. Sitting down, he locked his hands nervously about one knee and looked up with his eyes to Sinclair. "I come in for a quiet talk," said Sinclair, dropping his gun into the holster. That movement drew a sudden brightening of the eyes of Cartwright, who now straightened in his chair as if he had regained hope. "Don't make no mistake," said Sinclair, following the meaning of that change accurately. "I'm pretty handy with this old gun, partner. And on you, just now, there ain't any reason why I shouldn't take my time or any chances when it comes to shooting." Unconsciously, Cartwright moistened his white lips, and his eyes grew big again. "Except that the minute you shoot, you're a dead one, Sinclair." "Me? Oh, no. When a gun's heard, they'll all run to the room where the shot's been fired, and when they get that lock open, I'll be gone the way I come from." Sinclair smiled genially on his enemy. "Don't start raising any crop of delusions, friend. I mean business, a lot." "And talk business. I'll listen." "Oh, thanks. I come here about your wife." He watched Cartwright wince. In his heart, he pitied the man. All the story of Cartwright's spoiled boyhood and viciously selfish youth were written in his face for the reading of such a man as Sinclair. The rancher's son had begun well enough. Lack of discipline had undone him. But whether his faults were fixed or changeable, Sinclair could not tell. It was largely to learn this that he took the chances for the interview. "Go on," said Cartwright. "In the first place, do you know why she left you?" An anguish came across Cartwright's face. It taught Sinclair at least one thing, that the man loved her. "You're the reason, maybe." "Me? I never seen her till 2 days ago." "That's a tolerable ugly thing to say, Cartwright." "Well, I got a tolerable ugly reason for saying it," answered the other. The cowpuncher sighed. "I follow the way you drift, but you're wrong, partner. Fact is, I didn't know Cold Feet was a girl till this evening." Cartwright sneered, and Sinclair stiffened in his chair. "Son," he said gravely, "the worst enemies I got will all tell you that Riley Sinclair don't handle his own words careless. And I give you my solemn word of honor that I didn't know she was a girl till this evening, and that, right away after I found it out, I came down here to straighten things out with you, if I could. Will you believe it?" It was a strange study to watch the workings in the face of Cartwright, of hope, passion, doubt, hatred. He leaned closer to Sinclair, his big hands clutched together. "Sinclair, I wish I could believe it." "Look me in the eye, man. I can stand it." "By the Lord, it's true. But, Sinclair, have you come down to find out if I'd take her back?" "Would you?" The other grew instantly crafty. "She's done me a pile of wrong, Sinclair." "She has," said the cowpuncher. He went on gently. "She must have cut into your pride a lot." "Oh, if it was known," said Cartwright, turning pale at the thought. "She'd make me a laughing stock. Me, old Cartwright's son." "Yep, that'd be bad." He wondered at the frank egoism of the youth. "I leave it to you," said Cartwright, settling back in his chair. "Something ought to be done to punish her. Besides, she's a weight on your hands, and I can see you'd be anxious to get rid of her quick." "How do you aim to punish her?" asked Sinclair. "Me? Sure. Kind of a hard thing to do, wouldn't it be?" Cartwright's eyes grew small. "Ways could be found." He swallowed hard. "I'd find a heap of ways to make her wish she'd die sooner than shame me." "I suppose you could," said Sinclair slowly. He lowered his glance for a moment to keep his scorn from standing up in his eyes. "But I've heard of men, Cartwright, that love a woman so hard that they'd forgive anything." "The world's full of fools," said the rich rancher. He stabbed the stern forefinger into the palm of his other hand. "She's got to do a lot of explaining before I'd look at her. She's got to make me an accounting of every day she spent since I last seen her at—" "At the wedding?" asked Sinclair cruelly. Cartwright writhed in the chair till it groaned beneath his uneasy weight. "She told you that?" "Look here," went on Sinclair, assuming a new tone of frank inquiry. "Let's see if we can't find out why she left you." "There ain't any reason. Just plain fool woman, that's all." "But maybe she didn't love you, Cartwright. Did you ever think of that?" The big man stared. "Not love me? Who would she love, then? Was there anybody in them parts that could bring her as much as I could? Was there anybody that had as good a house as mine, or as much land, or as much cattle? Didn't I take her over the ground and show her what it amounted to? Didn't I offer to pick on my own string of riding horses? Did you do as much as that? Sure I did. She wouldn't have lacked for nothing. You sure must have loved her a lot, insinuated Sinclair. Must have been plumb foolish about her. Oh, I don't know about that. Love is one thing that ain't bothered me none. I got important interests, Sinclair. I'm a businessman, and this here marriage was a business proposition. Her dad was a businessman, and he fixed it all up for us. It was to tie the two biggest bunches of land together that could be found in them parts. Anyway, he grinned, I got the land. And why not let the girl go, then? Why? Asked Cartwright eagerly. Who wants her, you? Maybe, if you'd let her go. Not in 1,000 years. She's mine. There ain't no face but hers that I can see opposite me at the table. Not one. Besides, she's mine, and I'm going to keep her after I've taught her a lesson or two. Sinclair wiped his forehead hastily. Eagerness to jump at the throat of the man consumed him. He forced a smile upon his thin lips and persistently looked down. But think how easy it would be, Cartwright. Think how easy you could get a divorce on the grounds of desertion and drag all the shame into the courts. There's ways of hushing these here things up. It'd be easy. She wouldn't put up no defense, most like. You'd win your case, and if anybody asked questions, they'd simply say she was crazy and that you was lucky to get rid of her. They wouldn't blame you none, and it wouldn't be no disgrace to be deserted by a crazy woman, would it? Cartwright drew back into a shell of opposition. You talk pretty hot for this. Because I'm telling you the way out for both of you. I can't see it. She's coming back to me. Nobody else is going to get her. I've set my mind on it. Partner, don't you see that neither of you could ever be happy? Well, we'd be happy enough. I'd forgive her after a while. Yes, but what about her? About her? Why, curse her, what right has she got to be considered? Cartwright, she doesn't love you. The bulldog came into the face of Cartwright and contorted it. Don't she belong to me by law? Ain't she sworn to? Don't, said Sinclair, as if the words strangled him. Don't say that, Cartwright, if you please. Why not? You put up a good slick talk, Sinclair, but you don't win. I ain't going to give her up by no divorce. I'm going to keep her. I don't love her enough to want her back. I hate her enough. There's only one way that I'd stop caring about, stop fearing that she'd shame me, and that's by having her 6 feet underground. But you, Sinclair, you need coin. You're footloose. Suppose you was to take her and bring her to... Don't, cried Sinclair. Don't say it, Cartwright. Think it over again. Have mercy on her, man. She could make some home happy. Are you going to destroy that chance? Say, what kind of talk is this? Asked the big man. Now, said Sinclair, look to your own rotten soul. The strength of Cartwright was cut away at the root. The color was struck out of his face as by a mortal blow. What do you mean? He whispered. You don't deserve a man's chance, but I'm going to give it to you. Go get your gun, Cartwright. Cartwright slunk back into his chair. Do you mean murder, Sinclair? I mean a fair fight. You're a gunman. You've been raised and trained for gunfighting. I wouldn't have no chance. Sinclair controlled his scorn. Then I'll fight left-handed. I'm a right-handed man, Cartwright, and I'll take you with my gun in my left hand. That evens us up, I guess. No, it don't. But with a cry on his lips, the glance of Cartwright flickered past Sinclair. He grew thoughtful, less flabby. He seemed to be calculating his chances as his glance rested on the window. All right, he whispered, a fearful eye on Sinclair, as if he feared the latter would change his mind. "Give me a fair break." "I'll do it." Sinclair shifted his gun to his left hand and turned to look at the window which Cartwright had been watching with such intense interest. He had not half turned, however, when a gun barked at his very ear. It seemed a tongue of flame spat in from the window. There was a crash of glass, and a lamp was snuffed. Some accurate shot had cut the burning wick out of the lamp with his bullet, so nicely placed that, though the lamp reeled, it did not fall. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. With a spurt of flame, Sinclair leaped back until his shoulders grazed the wall. He crouched beside the massive chest of drawers. It might partially shelter him from fire from the window. There fell one of those deadly breathing spaces of silence. Silence, except for the chattering of the lamp as it steadied on the table and finally was still. There was a light crunching noise from the opposite side of the room. Cartwright had moved and put his foot on a fragment of the shattered chimney. Sinclair studied the window. It was a rectangle of dim light, but nothing showed in that frame. He who had fired the shot must have crouched at once, or else have drawn to one side. He waited with his gun poised. Steps were sounding far away in the building, steps which approached rapidly. Voices were calling. Somewhere on the farther side of the room, Cartwright must have found the best shelter he could, and Sinclair shrewdly guessed that it would be on the far side of the chest of drawers which faced him. In the meantime, he studied the blank rectangle of the window. Sooner or later, the man who stood on the ledge would risk a look into the dark interior. Otherwise, he would not be human. And sure enough, presently, the faintest shadow of an outline encroached on the solid rectangle of faint light. Sinclair aimed just to the right and fired. At once there was a splash of red flame and a thundering report from the other side of the room. Cartwright had fired at the flash of Sinclair's gun, and the bullet smashed into the chest beside Sinclair. As for Sinclair's own bullet, it brought only a stifled curse from the window. "Not good, Riley," sang out the voice. "The wall's too thick for a Colt." Sinclair had flung himself softly forward on his stomach, his gun in readiness and leveled in the direction of Cartwright. There was the prime necessity. Now heavy footfalls rushed down the hall, and a storm of voices broke in upon him. At the same time, Cartwright's gun spat fire again. The bullet buzzed angrily above Sinclair's head. His own brought a yell of pain, sharp as the yelp of a coyote. "Keep quiet, Cartwright," ordered the man at the window. "You'll get yourself killed if you keep risking it. Sheriff!" His voice rose and rang. "Blow the lock off the door. We got him." There was an instant reply in the explosion of a gun, the crash of broken metal. The door swung slowly in, admitting a dim twilight into the room. The light showed Sinclair one thing, the dull outlines of Cartwright. He whipped up his gun and then hesitated. It would be murder. He had killed before, but never save in fair fight, standing in a clear light before his enemy. He knew that he could not kill this rat he detested. He thought of the wrecked life of the girl and set his teeth. Still he could not fire. "Cartwright," he said softly, "I got you covered. Your right hand's on the floor with your gun. Don't raise that hand." In the shadow against the wall, Cartwright moved, but he obeyed. The revolver still glimmered on the floor. A new and desperate thought came to Sinclair, to rush straight for the window, shoot down the man on the ledge, and risk the leap to the ground. "Scatter back!" called the man on the ledge. That settled the last chance of Sinclair. There were guards on the ground, scattered about the house. He could never get out that way. "Keep out of the light by the door," commanded the man at the window, "and start shooting for the chest of drawers on the left-hand side of the room. And aim low down. May take time, but we'll get 'em." Obviously, the truth of that statement was too clear for Sinclair to deny it. He reviewed his situation with the swift calm of an old gambler. He had tried his desperate coup and had failed. There was nothing to do but accept the failure, or else make a still more desperate effort to rectify his position, risking everything on a final play. He must get out of the room. The window was hopelessly blocked. There remained the open door, but the hall beyond the door was crowded with men. Perhaps their very numbers would work against them. Even now they could be heard cautiously maneuvering. They would shoot through the door in his general direction, unaimed shots, with the hope of a chance hit, and eventually they would strike him down. Suppose he were to steal close to the door, leap over the bed, and plunge out among them, his Colt spitting lead and fire. That unexpected attack would cleave a passage for him. The more he thought of it, the more clearly he saw that the chances of escape to the street were at least 1 in 3. And yet he hesitated. If he made that break, 2 or 3 innocent men would go down before his bullets, as he sprang out, shooting to kill. He shrank from the thought. He was amazed at himself. Never before had he been so tender in expedience. He had always fought to win, cleanly, but to win. Why was he suddenly remembering that to these men he was an outlaw, fit meat for the first bullet they could send home? Had he been one of them, he would have taken up a position in that very hall, just as they were doing. Slowly, reluctantly, fighting himself as he did it, he shoved his revolver back into his holster and determined to take the chance of that surprise attack with his empty hands against their guns. If they did not drop him the instant he leaped out, he would be among them, too close for gunplay unless they took the chance of killing their own men. Keeping his gaze fixed on Cartwright across the room, for the moment he showed his intention, Cartwright would shoot. He maneuvered softly toward the bed. Cartwright turned his head, but made no move to lift his gun. There was a reason. The light from the door fell nearer to the rancher than it did to Sinclair. To Cartwright he must be no more than a shapeless blur. A gun exploded from the doorway, with only a glint of steel as the muzzle was shoved around the jamb. The bullet crashed harmlessly into the wall behind him. Another try. The sharp, stifling odor of burned powder began to fill the room, stinging the nostrils of Sinclair. Cartwright was coughing in a stifled fashion on the far side of the room, as if he feared a loud noise would draw a bullet his way. All at once there was no sound in the hotel, and as the wave of silence spread, Sinclair was aware that the whole little town was listening, waiting, watching. Not a whisper in the hall, not a stir from Cartwright across the room. The quiet made the drama seem unreal. Then that voice outside the window, which seemed to be Sinclair's nemesis, cried, "Steady, boys. Something's going to happen. He's getting ready. Buck up, boys." In a moment of madness, Sinclair decided to rush that window and dispose of the cool-minded speaker at all costs before he died. There, at least, was the one man he wished to kill. He followed that impulse long enough to throw himself siding along the floor so as not to betray his real strategic position to those at the door, and he splashed 2 bullets into the wall, trimming the side of the window. Only clear, deep-throated laughter came in response. "I told you, boys, I read his mind. And he's mad at me, huh?" But Riley Sinclair hardly heard the mocking answer. He had glided back behind the bed. The instant the shots were fired. As he moved, two guns appeared for a flickering instant around the edge of the doorway, one on each side. Their muzzles kicked up rapidly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and each, as he fired, spread the shots carefully from side to side. Sinclair heard the bullets bite and splinter the woodwork close to the floor. The chest of drawers staggered with the impact. He raised his own gun, watched one of the jumping muzzles for an instant, and then tried a snap shot. The report of his revolver was bitten off short by the clang of metal. There was a shouted curse from the hallway. He had blown the gun cleanly out of the sharpshooter's hand. Before the amazed rumble from the hall died away, Sinclair had acted. He shoved his weapon back into its holster and cleared the bed with a flying leap. From the corner of his eye he saw Cartwright snatch up his gun and take a chance shot that whistled close to his head, and then Sinclair plunged into the hall. One glimmering chance of success remained. On the side of the door toward which he drove, there were only 3 men in the hall. Behind him were more, far more, but their weapons were neutralized. They could not fire without risking a miss that would certainly lodge a bullet into the body of one of the men before Sinclair. Those men were kneeling, for they had been reaching out and firing low around the door to rake the floor of the room. At the appearance of Sinclair, they started up. He saw a gun jerk high for a snap shot, and swerving as he leaped, he drove out with all his weight behind his fist. The knuckles bit through flesh to bone. There was a jarring impact, and now only 2 men were before him. One of them dropped his gun. It was he who had just emptied his weapon into the room, and flung himself at Sinclair with outspread arms. The cowpuncher snapped up his knee, and the blow crumpled the other back and to the side. He sprang on toward the last man who barred his way, and all this in the split part of a second. Chance took a hand against him. In the very act of striking, his foot lodged on the first senseless body, and he catapulted forward on his hands. He struck the legs of the third man as he fell. Down they went together, and Sinclair lurched up from under the weight, only to be overtaken by many reaching hands from behind. That instant of delay had lost the battle for him, and as he strove to whirl and fight himself clear, an arm curled around his neck, shutting off his breath. A great weight jarred between his shoulders, and he pitched down to the floor. He stopped fighting. He felt his gun slipped from the holster. Deft, strong hands jerked his arms behind him and tied the wrists firmly together. Then he was drawn to his feet. All this without a word spoken, only the pant and struggle of hard-drawn breaths. Not until he stood on his feet again, with a bleeding-faced fellow rising with dazed eyes, and another clambering up unsteadily, with both hands pressed against his head, did the captors give voice. And their voice was a yell of triumph that was taken up in 2 directions outside the hotel. They became suddenly excited, riotously happy. In the overflowing of their joy, they were good-natured. Someone caught up Sinclair's hat and jammed it on his head. Another slapped him on the shoulder. "A fine game fight," said the latter. It was the man with the smeared face. He was grinning through his wounds. "Hardest punch I ever got, but I don't blame you, partner." Presently he saw Sheriff Kern. The latter was perfectly cool, perfectly grave. It was his arm that had coiled around the neck of Sinclair and throttled him into submission. "You didn't come out to kill, Sinclair. Why?" "I ain't used to slaughterhouse work," said Sinclair with equal calm, although he was panting. "Besides, it wasn't worth it. Murder never is." "Kind of late to come to that idea, son. Now just trot along with me, will you?" He paused. "Where's Arizona?" Cartwright lurched out of the room with his naked gun in his hand. Red dripped from the shallow wound where Sinclair's bullet had nicked him. He plunged at the captive, yelling. "Stop that fool!" snapped the sheriff. Half a dozen men put themselves between the outlaw and the Avenger. Cartwright straggled vainly. "Between you and me," said Sinclair coldly to the sheriff, "I think that skunk would plug me while I got my hands tied." The sheriff flashed a knowing glance up at his tall prisoner's face. "I don't know, Sinclair. Kind of looks that way." Although Cartwright had been persuaded to restore his gun to its cover, he passed through the crowd until he confronted Sinclair. "Now the tables is turned, huh? I'll take the high hand from now on, Sinclair." "It's no good," said Sinclair dryly. "The gent that shot out the light had a chance to see something before he done the shooting. And what he seen must have showed that you're yaller, Cartwright. Yaller as a yaller dog." Cartwright flung his fist with a curse into the face of the cowpuncher. The weight of the blow jarred him back against the wall, but he met the glare of Cartwright with a steady eye, a thin trickle of crimson running down his cut lips. The sheriff rushed in between and mastered Cartwright's arms. "One more little trick like that, stranger, and I'll turn you over to the boys. They got ways of teaching gents manners. How was you raised, anyway?" Suddenly sobered, Cartwright drew back from dark glances on every side. "Fellas," he said in a shaken voice, "I forgot his hands was tied, but I'm kind of wrought up. He tried to murder me." "It's all right, partner," drawled Red Chalmers, and he laid a strong hand on the shoulder of Cartwright. "It's all right. We all allow for one break, but don't do something like that twice, not in these parts." Sinclair walked beside the sheriff while the crowd poured past him and down the hall. When they reached the head of the stairs, they found the lighted room below filled with excited, upturned faces. At the sight of the sheriff and his prisoner, they roared their applause. The faces were blotted and blurred by a veil of rapidly, widely waving sombreros. The sheriff paused halfway down the stairs and held up his hand. Sinclair halted beside him, looking disdainfully over the crowd. Instantly, noise and movement ceased. It was a spectacular picture. The stubby little sheriff and the tall, lean, wolf-like man he had captured. It seemed a vivid illustration of the power of the law over the lawbreaker. Sinclair glanced down in wonder at Kern. It was in character for the sheriff to make a speech. A moment later, the sheriff's own words had explained his reason for the impromptu address. "Boys," he said, "I figure some of you has got an almighty big wish to see Sinclair on the end of a rope, huh?" A deep growl answered him. "Speaking personal," went on the sheriff smoothly, "I don't see how he's done a thing worth hanging. He took a prisoner away from me, and has resisted arrest. That's all. Sinclair has got a name as a killer. Maybe he is, but I know he ain't done no killing round these parts that's come to light yet. I'll tell you another thing. A minute ago he could have sent 3 men to death and maybe come off with a free skin. But he chose to take his chance without shooting to kill. He tried to fight his way out with his hands sooner than blow the heads off of gents that never done him no harm except to get in his way. Well, boys, that's something you don't often see. And I tell you this right now. If there's any lynch talk around this here town, you can lay to it that you'll have to shoot your way to Sinclair through me, and I'll be a dead one before you reach to him." He paused. Someone hissed from the back of the crowd, but the majority murmured in appreciation. "One more thing," went on the sheriff. "Some of you may think it was great guns to take Sinclair. It was a pretty good job, but there ain't no credit coming to me. I'm up here saying that all the praise goes to a fat friend of mine by name Arizona. If you got any free drinks, let 'em drift the way of Arizona. Hey, Arizona, step out and make a bow, will you?" But no Arizona appeared. The crowd cheered him, and then cheered the generous sheriff. Kern, who had won more by his frankness than he could possibly have won in half a dozen spectacular exploits with a gun. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The crowd swirled out of the hotel before the sheriff and his prisoner, and then swirled back again. No use following the sheriff if they hoped for details. They knew his silence of old. Instead, they picked off the members who had taken part in some phase of the fight, and drew them aside. As Sinclair went on down the street, the populace of Sour Creek was left pooled behind him. Various orators were giving accounts of how the whole thing had happened. Sinclair had neither eye nor ear for them, but he looked back and up to the western sky, with a flat-topped mountain clearly outlined against it. There was his country, and in his country he had left Jig alone and helpless. A feeling of utter desolation and failure came over him. He had started with a double goal, Sanderson or Cartwright or both. He had failed lamentably of reaching either one. He looked back to the sheriff, squat, insignificant, gray-headed. What a man to have blocked him. "But who's this Arizona?" he asked. "I don't know. Seems to have known you somewhere. Maybe a friend of yours, Sinclair." Said the cowpuncher. "Maybe. Tell me, was it him that was outside the window and trimmed the light on me?" "You got him right, Sinclair. That was the gent. Nice play he made, huh?" "Very pretty, Sheriff. I thought I knowed his voice." "He seemed to have made himself pretty infrequent. Didn't know Arizona was so darned modest." "Maybe he's got other reasons," said Sinclair. "What's his full name?" "Ain't that curious? I ain't heard of anybody else that knows it. He's a cool head, this Arizona. Seems to read your mind, and know just how you'd jump, Sinclair. I would have been off combing the trails, but he seemed to know that you'd come into town." "I'll sure keep him in mind if I ever meet up with him," murmured Sinclair. "Is this where I bunk?" The sheriff had paused before a squat, dumpy building, and was working noisily at the lock with a big key. Now that his back was necessarily toward his prisoner, two of the posse stepped up close beside Sinclair. They had none of the sheriff's nonchalance. One of them was the man whose head had made the acquaintance of Sinclair's knee, and both were ready for instant action of any description. "I'm Reinhardt," said one softly. "Keep me in mind, Sinclair. I'm him that you smashed with your knee. Dirty work. I'll see you when you get out of the lockup, if that ever happens." The voice of Sinclair was not so soft. "I'll meet you in jail or out," he answered. "On foot or on horseback, with fists or knife or gun. And you can lay to this, Reinhardt, I'll remember you a pile better than you'll remember me." All the repressed savagery of his nature came quivering into his voice as he spoke, and the other shrank instinctively a pace. In the meantime, the sheriff had succeeded in turning the rusted lock, which squeaked back. The door grumbled on its heavy hinges. Sinclair stepped into the musty, close atmosphere within. "Don't look like you've had much use for this here outfit," he said to the sheriff. The latter lighted a lantern. "Nope," he said. "It sure beats all how the luck runs, Sinclair. We had a pretty bad time with crooks around these parts, and them that was nabbed in Sour Creek got away. About 2 out of 3 before they was brought to me at Woodville. So the boys got together and ponied up for this little jail, and it's as neat a pile of mud and steel as you ever see. Look at them bars. Kind of rusty they look, but inside they're tool-proof. Oh, it's an up-to-date outfit, this jail. It's been a comfort to me, and it's a credit to Sour Creek. But the trouble is that since it was built, there ain't been no more than one or two put in it. Maybe you can make out here for the night. Have you over to Woodville in a couple of days, Sinclair." He brought his prisoner into a cage-like cell, heavily guarded, with bars on all sides. The adobe walls had been trusted in no direction. The steel lining was the strength of the Sour Creek jail. The sheriff himself set about shaking out the blankets. When this was done, he bade his two companions draw their guns and stand guard at the steel door to the cell. "Not that I don't trust you a good deal, Sinclair," he said, "but I know that a gent sometimes takes big chances." So saying, he cut the bonds of his prisoner. But instead of making a plunge at the door, Sinclair merely stretched his long arms luxuriously above his head. The sheriff slipped out of the door and closed it after him. A heavy and prolonged clangor followed, as steel jarred home against steel. "Don't go, Sheriff," said Sinclair. "I need a chat with you." "I'm in no hurry, and here's the gent we was talking about. Here's Arizona." The sheriff had waved his two companions out of the jail as soon as the prisoner was securely lodged, and no sooner was this done and they had departed through the doorway than the heavy figure of Arizona himself appeared. He came slowly into the circle of the lantern light, an oddly changed man. His swaggering gait, with heels that pounded heavily, was gone. He slunk forward soft-footed. His head, usually so buoyantly erect, was now sunk lower and forward. His high color had faded to a drab olive. In fact, from a free-swinging, jovial, somewhat overbearing demeanor, Arizona had changed to a mien of malicious and rather frightened cunning. In this wise he advanced, heedless of the curious and astonished sheriff, until his face was literally pressed against the bars. He peered steadily at Sinclair. On the face of the latter there had been at first blank surprise, then a gradual dawning recognition. Finally, he walked slowly to the bars. As Sinclair approached, the fat cowpuncher drew back, with lingering cat-like steps, as if he grudged every inch of his retreat, and yet dared not remain to meet Sinclair. "By the eternal," said Sinclair, "it's Dago." Arizona halted, quivering with emotions which the sheriff could not identify, save for a blind, intense malice. The tall man turned to the sheriff, smiling. "Dago Lansing, eh?" "Never heard that name," said the sheriff. "Maybe not," replied Sinclair, "but that's the man "You lie!" cried Arizona huskily, and his fat, swift hand fluttered nervously around the butt of the revolver. "Sheriff, there ain't nothing but lies stocked up in him. Don't believe nothing he says." "Huh!" chuckled Sinclair. "Why, Kern, he's a man about 8 years ago that I—" Pausing, he looked into the convulsed face of Arizona, who was apparently tortured with apprehension. "I won't go on, Dago," said Sinclair mildly. "But so you've carried this grudge all these days, huh?" Arizona tossed up his head. For a moment he was the Arizona the sheriff had known, but his laughter was too strident, and it was easy to see that he was at a point of hysterically high tension. "Well, I'd have carried it 80 years as easy as 8, declared Arizona. "I've been waiting all this time, and now I got you, Sinclair. You'll rot behind the bars the best part of the life that's left to you, and when you come out I'll meet you again." Sinclair smiled in a singular fashion. "Sorry to disappoint you, Dago, but I'm not coming out. I'm going to stay put. I'm through." The other blinked. "How come?" "It's something you couldn't figure," said Sinclair calmly, and he eyed the fat man as if from a great distance. Sinclair was remembering the day 8 years ago in a lumber camp to the north, when a shivering, meager, shifty-eyed youngster had come among them asking for work. They had taken pity on him, those big lumberjacks, put him up, given him money, kept him at the bunkhouse. Then articles began to disappear, watches, money. It was Sinclair who had caught the friendless stripling in the act of sleight of hand in the middle of the night, when the laborers, tired out, slept as if stunned. And when the others would have let the cringing, weeping youth go with a lecture and the return of his illicit spoils, it was the stern Sinclair who had insisted on driving home the lesson. He had forced them to strip Dago to the waist. Two stalwarts held his hands, and Sinclair laid on the whip. And Dago, the moment the lash fell, ceased his wailing and begging, and stood quivering, with his head bent, his teeth set and gritting, until the punishment was ended. It was Sinclair also who, when the thing was ended, and the others would have thrust the boy out penniless, who split the contents of his wallet with Dago. He remembered the words he had spoken to the stripling that day 8 years before. "You ain't had much luck out here in the West, kid, but stay around. Go south. Learn to ride a horse. There's nothing that puts heart and honesty into a man like a good horse. Don't go back to your city. You'll turn into a snake there. Stay out here and practice being a man, will you? Get the feel of a colt. Fight your way. Keep your mouth shut and work with your hands. And don't brag about what you know or what you've done. That's the way to get on. You got the markings in you, son. You got grit. I seen it when you was under the whip, and I wish I had the doing of that over again. I made a mistake with you, kid, but do what I've told you to do, and one of these days you'll meet up with me and beat me to the draw, and take everything you got as a grudge out on me. But you can't do it unless you turn into a man." Dago had listened in the most profound silence, accepted the money without thanks, and disappeared, never to be heard from again. In the sleek-faced man before him, Sinclair could hardly recognize that slender fellow of the lumber camp. Only the bright and agile eyes were the same, that, and a certain telltale nervousness of hand. The color was coming back into his face. "I guess I've done it," Arizona was saying. "I guess we're squared up, Sinclair." "Yep, and a balance on your side." "Maybe, maybe not. But I followed your advice, Long Riley. I've never forgot a word of it. It was printed into me." He made a significant short gesture, as if he were snapping a whip, and a snarl of undying malice curled his lips. "As long as you live, Sinclair," he added, "as long as you live, I'll remember." Even the sheriff shuddered at that glimpse into the black soul of a man. Sinclair alone was unmoved. "I reckon you've barked enough, Arizona," he suggested. "Suppose you trot along. I got to have a word with my friend the sheriff." Arizona waved his fat hand. He was recovering his ordinary poise, and with a smiling good night to the sheriff, he turned away through the door. "Nice friendly sort, huh?" remarked Sinclair, the moment he was alone with Kern. "I still got the chills," said the sheriff. "Sure has got a wicked pair of eyes, that Arizona." Kern cast an apprehensive glance at the closed door. Yet, in spite of the fact that it was closed, he lowered his voice. "What in thunder have you done to him, Sinclair?" "About 8 years ago," began Sinclair, and then stopped short. "Let it go," he went on. "No matter what Arizona is today, he sure improved on the gent I used to know. What's done is done. Besides, I made a mistake that time. I went too far with him. And a mistake is like borrowed money, Sheriff. It lays up interest and keeps compounding. When you have to pay back what you done a long time ago, you find it's a terrible pile. That's all I got to say about Arizona." Sheriff Kern nodded. "That's straight talk, Sinclair," he said softly. "But what was it you wanted to see me about?" "Cold Feet," said Sinclair. At once the sheriff brightened. "That's right," he said hurriedly. "You got the right idea now, partner. Glad to see you're using horse sense. And if you give me an idea of the trail that'll lead to Cold Feet, I can see to it that you get out of this mess pretty pronto. After all, you ain't done no real harm except for nicking Cartwright in the arm, and I figure that he needs a little punishment. It'll cool his temper down." "You think I ought to tell you where Cold Feet is?" asked Sinclair, without emotion. "Why not? Him and me sat around the same campfire, Sheriff, and ate off the same deer." At this the sheriff winced. "I know," he murmured. "It's hard, mighty hard." He continued more smoothly. "But listen to me, partner. There's $2,500 on the head of Cold Feet. Why not come in? Why not split on it? Plenty for both of us. And speaking personal, I could use half that money, and maybe you could use the other half just as well." "I'll tell you what I'll do," said Sinclair. "I'll give you the layout for finding Cold Feet. Ride west out of Sour Creek and head for a flat-topped mountain. On the shoulder, just under the head of the peak, you'll find Cold Feet. Go get 'em." The sheriff caught his breath. Then he whirled on his heel. The sharp voice of Sinclair called him back. "Wait a minute. I ain't through. When you catch Cold Feet, you go after him without guns." "How come?" "Because you might hurt him. And he can't fight, Sheriff. Even if he was to pull a gun, he couldn't hit nothing with it. He couldn't hit the ground he's standing on with a gun." Sheriff Kern scratched his head. "And when you get him," went on Sinclair, "tell him to go back and take up his life where he left off, because there's no harm coming to him." "Great guns, man. No harm coming to him, with a murder to his count and a price on his head?" "I mean what I say. Break it to him real gentle." "And who pays for the killing of Quade?" Sinclair smiled. He was finding it far easier to do than he had ever imagined. The moment he made the resolve, his way was smoothed for him. "I'll pay for Quade," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Because I killed him, Sheriff. Now go tell Cold Feet that his score is clean." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Toward the flat-topped mountain, with a feeling of his fate upon him, Bill Sanderson pushed his mustang through the late evening, while the darkness fell. He had long since stopped thinking, reasoning. There was only the strong, blind feeling that he must meet Sinclair face to face and decide his destiny in one brief struggle. So he kept on until a shadow fell faintly on his path before him, long, shapeless, grotesque. He turned and saw the moon coming up above the eastern mountains, a wan, sickly moon, hardly out of her first quarter, and even in the pure mountain air her light was dim. But it gave thought and pause to Sanderson. First, there was the outcropping of a singular superstition which he had heard long before and never remembered until this moment, that a moon seen over the left shoulder meant the worst of bad luck. It boded very ill for the end of this adventure. Suppose he were able only partially to surprise the big cowpuncher from the north, and that there was a call for fighting. What chance would he have in the dim, bewildering light of that moon against the surety of Sinclair, whose shot he knew, as other men point the finger, instinctively hitting the target? It would be a mere butchery, not a battle. Sending his mustang into a copse of young trees, he dismounted. His mind was made up not to attempt the blow until the first light of dawn. He would try to reach the top of the flat-crested mountain well before sunup, when there would be a real light instead of this ghostly and partial illumination from the moon. Among the trees he sat down and took up the dreadful watches of the night. Sleep never came near him. He was turning back the pages of his memory, reviewing his past with the singular clearness of a man about to die. For Sanderson had this mortal certainty resting upon his mind that he must try to strike down Sinclair, and that he would fail. And failure meant only one alternative, death. He was perfectly confident that this was the truth. He knew with prophetic surety that he would never again see the kind light of the sun, that in the half-light, in the cold of the dawn, a bullet would end his life. What he saw in the past was not comforting. A long train of vivid memories came up in his mind. He had accomplished nothing. In the total course of his life he had not made a man his friend, or won the love of a woman. In all his attempts to succeed in life, there had been nothing but disastrous failures, and wherever he moved, he involved others in his fall. Certainly, the prospecting trip with the 3 other men had been worse than all the rest, but it had been typical. It had been he who first suggested the trip, and he had rounded the party together and sustained it with enthusiasm. It had been he who led it into the mountains and across the desert, and on the terrible return trip he knew, with an abiding sense of guilt, that he alone could have checked the murderous and cowardly impulse of Quade. He alone could have overruled Quade and Lowrie, or failing to overrule them, he should at least have stayed with the cripple and helped him on, with the chance of death for them both. When he thought of that noble opportunity lost, he writhed. It would have gained the deathless affection of Hal Sinclair and saved that young, strong life. It would have won him more. It would have made Riley Sinclair his ally so long as he lived. And how easy to have done it, he thought, looking back. Instead, he had given way, and already the result had been the death of 3 men. The tale was not yet told, he was sure. Another death was due. A curse lay upon that entire party, and it would not be ended until he, Sanderson, the soul of the enterprise, fell. The moon grew old in the west. Then he took the saddle again and rode, brooding, up the trail, his horse stumbling over the stones as the animal grew wearier in the climb. And then, keeping his gaze fastened above him, he saw the outline of the crests grow more and more distinct. He looked behind. In the east the light was growing. The whole horizon was rimmed with a pale glow. Now his spirits rose. Even this gray dawn was far better than the treacherous moonlight. A daylight calm came over him. He was stronger, surer of himself. Impatiently he drew out his Colt and looked to its action. The familiar weight added to his self-belief. It became possible for him to fight, and being possible to fight, it was also possible to conquer. Presently he reached a bald upland. The fresh wind of the morning struck his face, and he breathed deep of it. Why could he not return to Sour Creek as a hero? And why could he not collect the price on the head of Riley Sinclair? The thought made him alert, savage. A moment later, his head pushing up to the level of the shoulder of the mountain, he saw his quarry. In the dimness of that early dawn, he made out the form of a sleeper huddled in blankets. But it was enough. That must be Riley Sinclair. It could not be another, and all his premonitions were correct. Suddenly he became aware that he could not fail. It was impossible. As gloomy as he had been before, his spirits now leaped to the heights. He swung down from the saddle, softly, slowly, and went up the hill without once drawing his eyes from that motionless form in the blankets. Once something stirred to the right and far below him. He flashed a glance in that direction, and saw that it was a hobbled horse, though not the horse of Sinclair, but that mattered nothing. The second horse might be among the trees. Easing his step and tightening the grip on his revolver, he drew closer. Should he shoot without warning? No. He would lean over the sleeper, call his name, and let him waken and see his death before it came to him. Otherwise, the triumph would be robbed of half of its sweetness. Now he had come sufficiently near to make out distinctly that there was only one sleeper. Had Sinclair and Cold Feet separated? If so, this must be Sinclair. The latter might have the boldness to linger so close to danger, but certainly never Cold Feet, even if he had once worked his courage to the point of killing a man. He stepped closer, leaned, and then, by the half-light, made out the pale, delicate features of the schoolteacher. For a moment, Sandersen was stunned with disappointment, and yet his spirits rose again almost at once. If Sinclair had fled, all the better. He would not return, at least for a long time, and in the meantime he, Sandersen, would collect the money on the head of Cold Feet. With the Colt close to the breast of Jig, he said, "Wake up, Cold Feet." The girl opened her eyes, struggled to sit up, and was thrust back by the muzzle of the gun, held with rock-like firmness in the hand of Sandersen. "Riley, what?" she muttered sleepily, and then she made out the face of Sandersen distinctly. Instantly she was wide awake, wider than ever, staring. Better to take the desperado alive than dead, far better. Cold Feet would make a show in Sour Creek for the glorification of Sandersen, as he rode down through the main street, and the men would come out to see the prize which even Sheriff Kern and his posse had not yet been able to take. "Roll over on your face." Cold Feet obeyed without a murmur. There was a coiled rope by the cinders of the fire. Sandersen cut off a convenient length and bound the slender wrists behind the back of the schoolteacher. Then he jerked his quarry to a sitting posture. "Where's Sinclair gone?" To his astonishment, Cold Feet's face brightened wonderfully. "Oh, then you haven't found him. You haven't found him. Thank goodness." Sandersen studied the schoolteacher closely. It was impossible to mistake the frankness of the latter's face. "By guns," he said at last, "I see it all now. The skunk sneaked off in the middle of the night and left you alone here to face the music." Jig flushed as she exclaimed, "That's not true. He's never run away in his life." "Maybe not," muttered Sandersen apprehensively. "Maybe he'll come back again. Maybe he's just rode off after something and will be back." At once the old fear swept over him. His apprehensive glance flickered over the rocks and trees around him. 1,000 secure hiding places. He faced the schoolteacher again. "Look here, Jig. You're charged with murder, you see. I can take you dead or alive, and the shot that bumped you off might bring Sinclair running to find out what happened, and he'd go the same way. But will you promise to keep your mouth shut and give no warning when Sinclair heaves in sight? Take your pick. It don't make no difference to me, one way or the other, but I can't have the two of you on my hands." To his surprise, Jig did not answer at once. "Ain't I made myself clear? Speak out." "I won't promise," said Cold Feet, raising the colorless face. "Then by thunder, I'll..." In the sudden contorting of his face, she saw her death, but as she closed her eyes and waited for the report and the tear of the bullet, she heard him muttering, "No, there's a better way." A moment later her mouth was wrenched open, and a huge wadded bandana was stuffed into it. Sandersen pushed her back to the ground and tossed the blanket over her again. "You ain't much of a man, Jig, but as a bait for my trap you'll do tolerable well. You're right. Sinclair's coming back, and when he comes I'll be waiting for him, out of sight behind the rock. "But listen to this, Jig. If you wrastle around and try to get that gag out of your mouth, I ain't going to take no chances. Whether Sinclair's in sight or not, I'm going to drill you clean. Now lie still and keep thinking on what I told you. I mean it all." With a final scowl, he left her and hurried to the rock. It made an ideal shelter for his purposes. On three sides, the rock made a thick and effectual parapet. 1,000 bullets might splash harmlessly against that stone, and through crevices he commanded the whole sweep of the mountainside beneath them. The courage which had been growing in Sandersen now reached the climax. Below him lay the helpless body of one prize, from a distance apparently a sound and quiet sleeper, though Sandersen could see the terrified glint of Jig's eyes. But he forgot that a moment later, when he saw the form of a horseman break out of covert from the trees farther down the mountain and immediately disappear again. Sinclair? He studied the barrel of the revolver, but the horseman appeared no more in the brightening and misty dawn. It was only after a long pause that there issued from the trees, not Riley Sinclair, but the squat, thick form of Arizona. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Behind the sheriff's apprehensive glance, there had been a reason. True, the door had closed upon Arizona, and the door was thick. But the moment Arizona passed through the door, he clapped his ear to the keyhole and listened, holding his breath, for he was certain that the moment his back was turned, the shameful story of his exploits in the lumber camp 8 years before would come out for the edification of Kern. If so, it meant ruin for him. Arizona was closed to him. All this district would be closed by the story of his early light-fingeredness. He felt as if he were being driven to the wall. Consequently, he listened with set teeth to the early questions of the sheriff. Then he breathed easier, still incredulous, when he heard Sinclair refuse to tell the tale. Still he lingered, dreading that the truth might come out. So he heard the talk turn to a new channel. Cold feet. Cold feet meant many things to Sour Creek. To Arizona, the schoolteacher meant only one thing: $2,500, and Arizona was broke. To his hungry ear came the tidings: "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you the layout for finding Cold Feet. Ride west out of Sour Creek and head for a flat-topped mountain. On the shoulder, just under the head, you'll find Cold Feet. Go get 'em." To Arizona it seemed as if this last injunction were personal advice. He waited to hear no more. If he had paused for a moment, he might have learned that the hope of $2,500 was an illusion and a snare. He saw the bright vision of a small fortune placed in his hands as the result of a single gunplay. He had seen the schoolteacher. He knew by instinct that there was no fighting quality in Jig, and the moment he heard the location, it was as good as cash in his pocket, he was sure. There was only one difficulty. He must beat out the sheriff. To that end, he hurried to the stable behind the hotel, broke all records for speed in getting the saddle on his roan mare, and then jogged her quietly out of town so as to rouse no suspicions. But hardly was he past the outskirts, hardly crediting his good luck that the sheriff himself was not yet on the way, than he touched the flanks with his spurs and sent the mare flying west. In the west the moon was dropping behind the upper ranges as he rode through the foothills. When he began to climb the side of the mountain, the dawn began to grow. So much the better for Arizona. But knowing that he had only Cold Feet to deal with, he did not adopt all the caution of Sandersen on the same trail. Instead, he cut boldly straight for the shoulder of the mountain, knowing what he would find there on his arrival. In the nearest grove he left his horse and then walked swiftly up to the level. There the first thing that caught his eyes was the form wrapped in the blanket. But the next thing he saw was the pale glimmer of the dawn on the barrel of a revolver. He reached for his own gun, only to see, over the rocks above him, the grinning face of Sandersen arise. "Too late, Arizona," called the tall man. "Too late for one job, partner, but just in time for the next." Arizona cursed softly, steadily, through snarling lips. "What job?" "Sinclair. He's gone, but he'll be back any minute, and it'll need both of us to down him, Arizona. We'll split on Sinclair's reward." Disgust and wrath consumed Arizona. Without other answer, he strode to the prostrate form, slashed the rope, and tore the handkerchief from between the teeth of Cold Feet. The schoolteacher sat up, gasping for breath, purple of face. "Leave him be!" cried Sandersen, his voice shrill with anger. "Leave him be! He's the bait, Arizona, and we're the trap that'll catch Sinclair." But Arizona cursed again bitterly. "Leave that bait till the sun burns it up. You'll never catch Sinclair with it." "How come?" From around the rock Sandersen appeared and walked down to the fat man. "Because Sinclair's already caught." If he had expected the tall man to groan with disappointment, there was a surprise in store for him. Sandersen exclaimed shrilly for joy. "Sinclair took dead, then?" "Dead? Why? You don't mean he was taken alive?" "Yes, I sure do. And I done the figuring that led up to him being caught." The slender form of Jig rose before them, trembling. "It isn't true! It isn't true! There aren't enough of you in Sour Creek to take Riley Sinclair." "Ain't it true?" asked Arizona. "All right, son. You'll meet him pronto in the Sour Creek jail, unless the boys finish their party of the other day and string you up before you get inside the jail." This brought a peculiar, low-pitched moan from Cold Feet. "Cheer up," said Sandersen. "You ain't swinging yet awhile." "But he's hurt. If he's alive, he's terribly wounded." Arizona beat down the appealing hand with a brutal gesture. "No, he ain't particular hurt. Just his neck squashed a bit where the sheriff throttled him. He didn't fight enough to get hurt, curse him." Frowning, Sandersen shook his head. "He's a fighting man, Arizona, if there ever was one." It seemed that everything infuriated the fat man. "What do you know about it, Lanky?" he demanded of Sandersen. "Didn't I run the affair? Wasn't it me that planted the whole trap? Wasn't it me that knowed he'd come into town for you or Cartwright?" "Cartwright?" gasped Jig. "Sure. We nailed him in Cartwright's room, just the way I said we would. And they laughed at me, the fools." He might have gathered singular inferences from the lowered head of Jig and the soft murmur, I might have known he'd try for me." "And I might have had the pleasure of drilling him clean," said Arizona, harking back to it with savage pleasure. "But I shot out the light. I wanted him to die slow, and before the end I wanted to pry his eyes open and make him see my face and know that it was me that done for him. That was what I wanted, but he turned yellow and wouldn't fight." "He wouldn't kill," said Jig coldly. "But for courage, I laugh at you, Arizona." "Easy," scowled the cowpuncher. "Easy, Jig. You ain't behind the bars yet. You're in reach of my fist, and I'd think nothing of busting you in the face. Shut up till I talk to you." The misty eyes of Sandersen brightened a little and grew hard. There was a great deal of fighting spirit in the man, and his easy victory of that morning had roused him to a battling pitch. "Looks to me like you ain't running this here party, Arizona," he said dryly. "If there are any directions to give Cold Feet, I'll give 'em. It was me that took him." No direct answer could Arizona find to this true statement, and as always when a man is at loss for words, his temper rose and his fists clenched. For the first time he looked at Sanderson with an eye of savage calculation. He had come to hope for a tidy little fortune. He had found it snatched out of his hand, and as he measured Sanderson, his heart rose. $2,500 would fairly well equip him for life. The anger faded out of his eyes, and in its place came the cold gleam of the man who thinks and calculates. All at once he began to smile, a mirthless smile that was of the lips only. "Maybe you're right, Sanderson, but I'm thinking you'll have to prove that you took Cold Feet." "Prove it?" "Sure. The boys wouldn't be apt to believe that sleepy Sanderson woke up and took Cold Feet alive." Instantly the gorge of Sanderson rose, and he began to see red. "Are you out to find trouble, Fatty?" The adjective found no comfortable lodging place in the mind of Arizona. "Me? Sure I ain't. I was just stating facts the way I know 'em." "Well, the facts you know ain't worth a damn." "No?" It was growing clearer and clearer to the fat man that between him and the $2,500 there stood only the unamiable figure of the long, lean cowpuncher. He steadied his eye till a fixed glimmer came in it. He hated lean men by instinct and distrusted them. "Sure they ain't. How you going to get around the fact that I did take Cold Feet?" "Well, Sanderson, you see that they's $2,500 hanging on the head of this Cold Feet?" "Certainly, and I see 10 ways of spending just that amount." "So do I," said Arizona. "You do?" "Partner, you've heard me talk." "Arizona, you're talking mighty queer. What do you mean?" "Now suppose it was me that brought in Cold Feet, who'd get the money?" "Why, you that brought him in?" "Yup, me. And suppose I brought him in with 2 murder charges to him instead of 1?" "I don't follow you. What's the second murder, Fatty?" "You." Sanderson blinked and gave back a little. Plainly he was beginning to fear that the reason of Arizona was unbalanced. He shook his head. "I'll show you how it will be charged to Cold Feet," said the fat man. Taking the cartridge belt of Jig, he shook the revolver out of the holster and pumped the shot into the ground. The sharp crack of the explosion roused no echo for a perceptible space. Then it struck back at them from a solid wall of rock, almost as loud as it had been in fact. Off among the hills the echo was repeated to a faint whisper. Arizona dropped the revolver carelessly on the ground. "Fatty, you've gone nutty," said Sanderson. "I'll tell you a yarn," said Arizona. Sanderson looked past him to the east. The light was growing rapidly about the mountains. In another moment or so, the sunrise, which he had been looking forward to with such solemn dread, would occur. He was safe, of course, and still that sense of impending danger would not leave him. He noted Jig, erect, very pale, watching them with intense and frightened interest. "Here's the story," went on the fat man. "I come out of Sour Creek hunting for Cold Feet. I came straight to this here mountain. Halfway up the side I heard a shot. I hurry along and soft foot on to this shoulder. I see Cold Feet standing over the dead body of Sanderson. Then I stick up Cold Feet and take him back to Sour Creek and get the reward. Won't that be 2 murders on his head?" The thin Swede rubbed his chin. "For a grown man, Fatty, you're doing a lot of supposing." "I'm going to turn it into facts," said Arizona. "How?" "With a chunk of lead. Pull your gun, you lanky fool." It seemed to Jig, watching with terrible interest, that Sanderson stared, not at Arizona as he went for his gun, but beyond the stubby cowpuncher, far behind and into the east, where the dawn was growing brighter, losing its color, as sunrises do, just before the rising of the sun. His long arm jerked back, the revolver whipped into his hand, and he stiffened his forearm for the shot. All that Jig saw, with eyes sharpened so that each movement seemed to be taking whole seconds, was a sneering Arizona, waiting to the last second. When he moved, however, it was with an almost leisurely flip of the wrist. The heavy Colt was conjured into his hand. With graceful ease, the big weapon slipped out and exploded before Sanderson's forefinger had curled around the trigger. Out of the hand of the Swede slipped the gun and clanged unheeded on the ground at his feet. She saw a patch of red spring up on his breast, while he lurched forward with long, stiff strides, threw up his hands to the east, and pitched on his face. She turned from the dead thing at her feet. The white rim of the sun had just slid over the top of a mountain. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. She dropped to her knees, and with a sudden hysterical strength, she was able to turn him on his back. He was dead. The first glimpse of his face told her that. She looked up into the eyes of the murderer. Arizona was methodically cleaning his gun. His color had not changed. There was a singular placidity about all his movements. "I just hurried up what was coming to him," said Arizona coolly, as he finished reloading his Colt. "Sinclair was after him, and that meant he was done for." Oddly enough, she found that she was neither very much afraid of the fat man, nor did she loathe him for his crime. He seemed outside of the jurisdiction of the laws which govern most men. "You said Sinclair's in jail." "Sure, and he is. But they don't make jails strong enough in these parts to hold Sinclair. He'd have come out and landed Sanderson, just as he's going to come out and land Cartwright. What's he got against Cartwright, do you know?" Oh, it was incredible that he could talk so calmly with the dead man before him. "I don't know," she murmured, and drew back. "Well, take it all in all," pursued Arizona, "this deal of mine is pretty rotten. But you'd swing just the same for one murder as for two. They won't hang you no deader, eh? And when they come to look at it, this is pretty neat. Sanderson wasn't no good. Everybody knowed that. But he had one thing I wanted, which was you and the 2,500 that goes with the gent that brings you into Sour Creek. So at the price of one bullet, I get the coin. Pretty neat, I say again." Dropping the revolver back into the holster, he patted it with a caressing hand. "There's your gun," went on Arizona, chuckling. "It's got a bullet fired out of it. There's Sanderson's gun with no bullet fired, showing that, while he was stalking you, you shot and drilled him. Here's my gun with no sign of a shot fired, which proves that I just slid in here and stuck you up from behind while you were looking over the gent you just killed." He rubbed his hands together, and bracing himself firmly on his stubby legs, looked almost benevolently on Jig. Not only did she lose her horror of him, but she gained an impersonal, detached interest in the workings of his mind. She looked on him not as a man, but as a monster in the guise of a man. "Two deaths," she said quietly, "for your money. You work cheaply, Arizona." Jig's criticism seemed to pick him. "How come?" "Sanderson's death by your bullet, and mine when I die in the law. Both to your account, Arizona, because you know I'm innocent." "I know it, but a hunch ain't proof in the eyes of the law. Besides, I don't work so cheap. Sanderson was no good. He ain't worth thinking about. And as for you, Jig, though I don't like to throw it in your face, As a schoolteacher you may be all right, but as a man you ain't worth a damn. Nope, I wouldn't give neither you a thought, except for Sinclair." "Ah." "Him and you have been bunkies. If he should ever find out what I done, he'd go on my trail. Maybe he will anyway, and he's a bad one to have on a gent's trail." "You fear him?" she asked curiously, for it had seemed impossible that this cold-blooded gunman feared any living thing. He rolled a cigarette meditatively before he answered. "Sure," he said, "I fear him. I ain't a fool. It was him that started me, and him that gave me the first main lessons. But I ain't got the natural talent with a gun that Sinclair has got." Nodding his head in confirmation, his expression softened as with the admiration of one artist for a greater kindred spirit. "The proof is that there's a long list of gunfights in Sinclair's past, but not more deaths than you can count on the fingers of one hand. And them that he killed was plumb no good. The rest he winged and let 'em go. That's his way, and it takes an artist with a gun to work like that. Yep, he's a great man, curse him. Only one weak thing I ever heard of him doing. He buckled to the sheriff and told him where to find you." Scratching a match on his trousers, the cowpuncher was amazed to hear Jig cry, "You lie!" He gaped at her until the match singed his fingers. That's a tolerable loud word for a kid to use. Apparently he meditated punishment, but then he shrugged his shoulders and lighted his cigarette. "Wild horses couldn't have dragged it out of him," Jig was repeating. "Say," said the fat man, grinning, "how'd you know? I knew where you was." Like a blow in the face, it silenced her. She looked miserably down to the ground. Was it possible that Sinclair had betrayed her? Not for the murder of Quade. He would be more apt to confess to that himself. And indeed, she dreaded the confession. But if he let her be dragged back, if her identity became known, she faced what was more horrible to her than hanging, and that was life with Cartwright. "Which reminds me," said Arizona, "that the old sheriff may not wait for morning before he starts after you. Just slope down the hill and saddle your horse, will you?" Automatically she obeyed, wild thoughts running through her mind. To go back to Sour Creek meant a return to Cartwright, and then nothing could save her from him. Halfway to her saddle, her foot struck metal, her own gun, which Arizona had dropped after firing the bullet. Was there not a possibility of escape? She heard Arizona humming idly behind her. Plainly, he was entirely off guard. Bending with the speed of a bird in picking up a seed, she scooped up the gun, whirling with the heavy weapon extended, her forefinger curling on the trigger. But as she turned, the humming of Arizona changed to a low snarl. She saw him coming like a bolt. The gun exploded of its own volition, it seemed to her, but Arizona had swerved in his course, and the shot went wild. The next instant he struck her. The gun was wrenched from her hand, and a powerful arm caught her and whirled her up, only to hurl her to the ground. Arizona's snarling, panting face bent over her. In the very midst of that fury, she felt Arizona stiffen and freeze. The snarling stopped. His nerveless arm fell away, and she was allowed to stagger to her feet. She found him staring at her with a peculiar horror. "Murder and guns," whispered Arizona. Now she understood that he knew. She saw him changed, humbled, disarmed before her. But even then she did not understand the profound meaning of that moment in the life of Arizona. But to have understood, she would have had to know how that life began in a city slum. She would have had to see the career of the sneak thief, which culminated in the episode of the lumber camp 8 years before. She would have had to understand how the lesson from the hand of Big Sinclair had begun the change which transformed the sneak into the dangerous man of action. And now the second change had come. For Arizona had made the unique discovery that he could be ashamed. He would have laughed had another told him. Virtue was a name and no more to the fat man. But in spite of himself, those 8 years under free skies had altered him. He had been growing when he thought he was standing still. When the eye plunges 40 miles from mountain to mountain through crystal clear air, the mind is enlarged. He had lived exclusively among hard-handed men, rejoicing in a strength greater than their own. He suddenly found that the feeble hand from which he had so easily torn the weapon a moment before had in an instant acquired strength to make or break him. All that Jig could discern of this was that her life was no longer in danger, and that her enemy had been disarmed. But she was not prepared for what followed. Dragging off his hat, as if he acted reluctantly, his eyes sank until they rested on the ground at her feet. "Lady," he said, "I didn't know. I didn't even dream what you was." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gradually she found her breath and greater self-possession. "You mean I'm free?" she asked him. "You won't make me go into Sour Creek?" His face twisted as if in pain. "Make you?" he asked violently. "I'd blow the head off the first one that tried to make you take a step." Suddenly it seemed to her that all this was ordered and arranged, that some mysterious providence had sent this man to save her from Sanderson, and all the horror that the future promised, just as Sinclair had saved her once before from a danger which he himself had half created. "I got to say this," went on Arizona, struggling for words. "Looks to me like you might have need of a friend to help you along, wherever you're going." He shook his thick shoulders. "Sure gives me a jolt to think of what you must have gone through, wandering around here all by yourself. I sure don't see how you done it." And all this time the man whom Arizona had killed was lying face up to the morning, hardly a pace behind him. But she dared not try to analyze this man. She could only feel vaguely that an ally had been given her, an ally of strength. He, too, must have sensed what was in her mind. "You'll be wanting this, I reckon." Returning the Colt to her, he slowly dragged his glance from the ground and let it cross her face for a fleeting instant. She slipped the gun back into its holster. "And now suppose we go down the hill and get your horse." Evidently he was painfully eager to get the dead man out of sight, yet he paused while he picked up her saddle. "They'll be along pretty pronto, the sheriff and his men. They'll take care of him." Leading the way down to her hobbled horse, he saddled it swiftly, while she stood aside and watched. When he was done, he turned to her. "Maybe we'd better be starting. It won't come in very handy for Kern to find us here, huh?" Obediently she came. With one hand he held the stirrup, while the other steadied her weight by the elbow as she raised her foot. In spite of herself, she shivered at his touch. A moment later, from the saddle, she was looking down into his darkly crimsoned face. Plainly, he had understood that impulse of aversion, but he said nothing. There was a low neigh from the other side of the hill in answer to his soft whistle, and then out of the trees came a beautifully formed roan mare, with high head and pricking ears. With mincing steps she went straight to her master, and Jig saw the face of the other brighten. But he was gloomy again by the time he had swung into the saddle. "Now," he said, "where away?" "You're coming with me?" she asked. with a new touch of alarm. She regretted her tone the moment she had spoken. She saw Arizona wince. "Lady," he said, "suppose I come clean to you. I've been in my time about everything that's bad. I ain't done a killing except squarely. Sinclair taught me that. And you got to allow that what I done to Sanderson was after I give him all the advantage in the draw. I took even chances, and I give him better than an even break. Ain't that correct?" She nodded, fascinated by the struggle in his face between pride and shame and anger. "Worse than that," he went on, forcing out the bitter truth. "I've been everything down to a sharp with the cards, which is tolerable low. But I got this to say. I'm playing clean with you. I'll prove it before I'm done. If you want me to break loose and leave you alone, say the word and I'm gone. If you want me to stay and help where I can, say the word, and I stay and take orders. Come out with it." Gathering his reins, he sat very straight and looked her fairly and squarely in the eye, for the first time since he had discovered the truth about Cold Feet. In spite of herself, Jig found that she was drawn to trust the fat man. She let a smile grow, let her glance become as level and as straight as his own. She reined her horse beside his and stretched out her hand. "I know what you mean to say," said Jig, "and I don't care what you have been in the past. I do need a friend, desperately. Riley Sinclair says that a friend is the most sacred thing in the world. I don't ask that much, but of all the men I know, you are the only one who can help me as I need to be helped. Will you shake hands for a new start between us?" "Lady," said the cowpuncher huskily, "this sure means a lot to me. And the other things you'll forget." "I never knew you," said the girl, smiling at him again, "until this moment." "Oh, it's a go!" cried Arizona. "Now try me out." Jig saw his self-respect come back to him, saw his eye grow bright and clear. Arizona was like a man with a new, good resolution. He wanted to test his strength and astonish someone with his change. "There's one great thing in which I need help," she said. "Good. And what's that?" "Riley Sinclair's in jail." Muttered Arizona. "He ain't in on a serious charge. Let him stay a while." Stiffening in the saddle, he stared at her. "Does Sinclair know?" "What?" asked the girl, but she flushed in spite of herself. "That you ain't a man?" "Yes." For a moment he considered her crimson face gloomily. "You and Sinclair was sort of pals, I guess," he said at length. Faintly she replied in the affirmative, and her secret was written as clearly as sunlight on her face. Yet she kept her eyes raised bravely. As for Arizona, the newborn hope died in him, and then flickered back to an evil life. If Sinclair was in his way, why give up? Why not remove this obstacle as he had removed others in his time? The hurrying voice of the girl broke in on his somber thoughts. "He went to Sour Creek to help me as soon as he found out that I was not a man. He put himself in terrible danger there on my account." "Did Cartwright have something to do with you and him?" "Yes." But Arizona made no effort to read her riddle. She went on. "Now that he has been taken, I know what has happened. To keep me out of danger, he told—" "That you're a woman?" "No, he wouldn't do that, because he knows that is the last thing in the world that I want revealed. But he's told them that he killed Quade, and now he's in danger of his life." "Let's ride on," said Arizona. "I got to think a pile." She did not speak, while the horses wound down the steep side of the mountain. Mile after mile rose behind them. The sun increased in power, flashing on the leaves of the trees and beginning to burn the face with its slanting heat. Now and then she ventured a side glance at Arizona, and always she found him in a brown study. Vaguely she knew that he was fighting the old battle of good and evil in the silence of the morning. Finally he stopped his horse and turned to her again. They were in the foothills by this time, and they had drawn out from the trees to a little level space on the top of a rise. The morning mist was thinning rapidly in the heart of the hollow beneath them. Far off, they heard the lowing of cows being driven into the pasture land after the morning milking, and they could make out tiny figures in the fields. "Lady," Arizona was saying to her, "there's one gent in the world that I've got an 8-year-old grudge against. I've swore to get him sooner or later, and that gent is Riley Sinclair. Make it something else, and I'll work for you till the skin's off my hands. But Sinclair—" He stopped, studying her intently. "Will you tell me one thing? How much does Sinclair mean to you?" "A great deal," said the girl gently. "But if you hate him, I can't ask you." "He's a hard man," said Arizona, "and he's got a mean name, lady. You know that. But when you say that he means a lot to you, maybe it's because he's taken a big chance for you in Sour Creek, and—" She shook her head. "It's more than that, much more." "Well, I guess I understand," said Arizona. Burying the last of his hopes, Arizona looked straight into the sun. 8 years ago he was a better man than I am," he said at length. "And he's a better man still. Lady, I'm going to get Riley Sinclair free." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As Arizona had predicted, Sheriff Kern was greatly tempted not to start on the hard ride for the mountains before morning, and finally he followed his impulse. With the first break of the dawn he was up, and a few minutes later he had taken the trail alone. There was no need for numbers, for that matter, to tell a single man that he no longer needed dread the law. But it was only common decency to inform him of the charge, and Kern was a decent sort. He was thoughtful on the trail. A great many things had happened to upset the sheriff. The capture of Sinclair, taken all in all, was an important event. To be sure, the chief glory was attributable to the cunning of Arizona. Nevertheless, the community was sure to pay homage to the skill of the sheriff who had led the party and managed the capture. But now the sheriff found himself regretting the capture and all its attendant glory. Not even a personal grudge against the man who had taken his first prisoner from him could give an edge to the sheriff's satisfaction, for during the late hours of the preceding night he had heard from Sinclair the true story of the killing of Quade, not a murder, but a fair fight. And he had heard more, the whole unhappy tale which began with the death of Hal Sinclair in the desert, a story which now included, so far as the sheriff knew, 3 deaths, with a promise of another in the future. It was little wonder that he was disturbed. His philosophy was of the kind that is built up in a country of horses, hard riding, hard work, hard fighting. According to the precepts of that philosophy, Sinclair would have shirked the vital moral duty had he failed to avenge the pitiful death of his brother. The sheriff put himself into the boots of the man who was now his prisoner and facing a sentence of death. In that man's place, he knew that he would have taken the same course. It was a matter of necessary principle, and the sheriff also knew that no jury in the country could allow Sinclair to go free. It might not be a death sentence, but it would certainly be a prison term as bad as death. These thoughts consumed the time of the sheriff until his horse had labored up the height, and he came to the little plateau where so much had happened outside of his ken. And there he saw Bill Sanderson, with the all-seeing sun on his dead eyes. For a moment the sheriff could not believe what he saw. Sanderson was, in the phrase of the land, Sinclair's meat. It suddenly seemed to him that Sinclair must have broken from jail and done this killing during the night. But a moment's reflection assured him that this could not be. The mind of the sheriff whirled. Not Sinclair, certainly. The man had been dead for some hours. In the sky far above and to the north, there were certain black specks moving in great circles that drifted gradually south. The buzzards were already coming to the dead. He watched them for a moment with the sinking of the heart which always comes to the man of the mountain desert when he sees those grim birds. It was not Sinclair. But who then? He examined the body and the wound. It was a center shot, nicely placed. Certainly not the sort of shot that Cold Feet, according to the description which Sinclair had given of the latter's marksmanship, would have been apt to make. But there was no other conclusion to come to. Cold Feet had certainly been here, according to Sinclair's confession, and it was certainly reasonable to suppose that Cold Feet had committed this crime. The sheriff placed the hat of Sinclair over his face and swung back into his saddle. He must hurry back to Sour Creek and send up a burial party, for no one would have an interest in interring the body in the town. But once in the saddle, he paused again. The thought of the schoolteacher having killed so formidable a fighter as Sanderson stuck in his mind as a thing too contrary to probability. Moreover, the sheriff had grown extremely cautious. He had made one great failure very recently, the escape of this same Cold Feet. He would have failed again had it not been for Arizona. He shuddered at the thought of how his reputation would have been ruined had he gone on the trail and allowed Sinclair to double back to Sour Creek and take the town by surprise. Dismounting, he threw his reins and went back to review the scene of the killing. There were plenty of tracks around the place. The gravel obscured a great part of the marks, and still other prints were blurred by the dead grass. But there were pockets of rich, loamy soil, moist enough and firm enough to take an impression as clearly as paper takes ink. The sheriff removed the right shoe from the foot of Sanderson and made a series of fresh prints. They were quite distinctive. The heel was turned out to such an extent that the track was always a narrow indentation, where the heel fell on the soft soil. He identified the same tracks in many places, and dismissing the other tracks, the sheriff proceeded to make up a trail history for Sanderson. He came up the hill on foot. Here he paused beside the embers of the fire and remained standing for a long time, for the marks were worked in deeply. After a time the trail went. He followed it with difficulty over the hard-packed gravel, up the side of the hill to a semicircular arrangement of rocks, and there, distinct in the soil, was the impression of the body where the cowpuncher had lain down. The sheriff lay down in turn, and at once he was sure why Sanderson had chosen this spot. He was defended perfectly on three sides from bullets, and in the meantime, through crevices in the rock, he maintained a clear outlook over the whole side of the hill. Obviously, Sanderson had lain down to keep watch. For what? For Cold Feet, of course, on whose head a price rested, or at least so Sinclair must have believed at the time. The news had not yet been published abroad that Cold Feet had been exculpated by the confession of Sinclair to the killing of Quade. So much was clear, but presently Sanderson had risen and gone down the hill again, leaving from the other side of the rock. Had he covered Cold Feet when the latter returned to his camp, having been absent when Sanderson first arrived? No, the tracks down the hill were leisurely, not the long strides which a man would make to get close to one whom he had covered with a revolver from a distance. Reaching the shoulder of the mountain, Kern puzzled anew. He began a fresh study of the tracks. Those of Cold Feet were instantly known by the tiny size of the marks of the soles. The sheriff remembered that he had often wondered at the smallness of the schoolteacher's feet. Cold Feet was there, and Sanderson was dead. Again it seemed certain that Cold Feet had been guilty of the crime. But the sheriff kept on systematically hunting for new evidence. He found no third set of tracks for some time. But when he did find them, they were very clear. A short, broad foot, the imprint of a heavy man. A fat man, then, no doubt. From the length of the footprint, it was very doubtful if the man were tall, and certainly, by the clearness of the indentation, the man was heavy. The sheriff could tell by making a track beside that of the quarry. A second possibility, therefore, had entered, and the sheriff felt a reasonable conviction that this must be the guilty man. Now he combed the whole area for some means of identifying the third man who had been on the mountainside. But nothing had been dropped except a brilliant bandana, wadded compactly together, which the sheriff recognized as belonging to Sanderson. There was only one definite means of recognizing the third man. Very faint in the center of the impression made by his soul were two crossed arrows, the sign of the bootmaker. The sheriff shook his head. Could he examine the soles of the boots of every man in the vicinity of Sour Creek, even if he limited his inquiry to those who were short and stocky? And might not there be many a man who wore the same type of boots? He flung himself gloomily into his saddle again, and this time he headed straight down the trail for Sour Creek. At the hotel he was surrounded by an excited knot of people who wished to know how he had extracted the amazing confession from Riley Sinclair. The sheriff tore himself away from a dozen hands who wished to buttonhole him in close conversation. "I tell you gents this," he said. "Quade was killed because he needed killing, and Sinclair confessed because he's straight." With that, casting an ugly glance at the lot of them, he went back into the kitchen and demanded a cup of coffee. The Chinese cook obeyed the order in a hurry, highly flattered and not a little nervous at the presence of the great man in the kitchen. While Kern was there, Arizona entered. The sheriff greeted him cheerfully, with his coffee cup balanced in one hand. "Arizona," he said, "or Dago, or whatever you like to be called." "Cut the Dago part, will you?" demanded Arizona. "I ain't no ways wishing to be reminded of that name. Nobody calls me that." Kern grinned covertly. "I suppose," said Arizona slowly, "that you and Sinclair had a long yarn about when he knew me some time back." The sheriff shook his head. "Between you and me," he said frankly, "it sounded to me like Sinclair knew something you mightn't want have noised around. Is that straight?" "I'll tell you," answered the other. "When I was a kid, I was a fool kid. That's all it amounts to." Sheriff Kern grunted. "All right, Arizona, I ain't asking. But you can lay to it that Sinclair won't talk. He's as straight as I ever seen." "Maybe," said Arizona, "but he's slippery. And I got this to say. Let me have the watch over Sinclair while he's in Sour Creek, or are you taking him back to Woodville today?" "I'm held over," said the sheriff. He paused. Twice the little olive-skinned man from the South had demonstrated his superiority in working out criminal puzzles. The sheriff was prone to unravel the new mystery by himself, if he might. "By what?" "Oh, by something I'll tell you about later on," said the sheriff. "It don't amount to much, but I want to look into it." Purposely, he had delayed sending a party to bury Sanderson. It would be simply warning the murderer if that man were in Sour Creek. "About you and Sinclair," went on the sheriff. "There ain't much good feeling between you, eh?" "I won't shoot him in the back if I guard him," declared Arizona. "But if you want one of the other boys to take the jog, go ahead. Put Red on it." "He's too young. Sinclair gets him off guard by talking." "Then try Wood." "Wood ain't his best off the trail. Come to think about it, I'd rather trust Sinclair to you. That is, if you make up your mind to treat him square." "Sheriff, I'll give him a squarer deal than you think." Kern nodded. "More coffee, Lee," he called. Lee obeyed with such haste that he overbrimmed the cup, and some of the liquid washed out of the saucer onto the floor. "Coming back to shop talk," went on the sheriff, as Lee mopped up the spilled coffee, mumbling excuses. "I ain't had a real chance to tell you what a fine job you done for us last night, Arizona." Arizona, with due modesty, waved the praise away and stepped to the container of matches hanging beside the stove. He came back lighting a cigarette and contentedly puffed out a great cloud. "Forget all that stuff, Sheriff, will you?" "Not if I live to be 100, answered the sheriff with frank admiration. So saying, his eyes dropped to the floor and remained there riveted. The foot of Arizona had rested on the spot where the coffee had fallen. The print was clearly marked with dust, except that in the center, where the sole had lain, there was a sharply defined pair of crossed arrows. A short, fat, heavy man. The sheriff raised his glance and examined the bulky shoulders of the man. Then he hastily swallowed the rest of his coffee. Yet there might be a dozen other short, stocky men in town whose boots had the same impression. He looked thoughtfully out the kitchen window, striving to remember some clue. But as far as he could make out, the only time Arizona and Sanderson had crossed had been when the latter applied for a place on the posse. Surely a small thing to make a man commit a murder. "If you give me the job of guarding Sinclair," said Arizona, "I'd sure—" "Wait a minute," cut in the sheriff. "I'll be back right away. I think that was Mackenzie who went into the stable. Don't leave until I come back, Arizona." Hurriedly he went out. There was no Mackenzie in the stable, and the sheriff did not look for one. He went straight to Arizona's horse. The roan was perfectly dry, but examining the hide, the sheriff saw that the horse had been recently groomed, and a thorough grooming would soon dry the hair and remove all traces of a long ride. Stepping back to the peg from which the saddle hung, he raised the stirrup leather. On the inside, where the leather had chafed the side of the horse, there was a dirty gray coating, the accumulation of the dust and sweat of many a ride. But it was soft with recent sweat, and along the edges of the leather there was a barely dried line of foam that rubbed away readily under the touch of his fingertip. Next, he examined the bridle. There also were similar evidences of recent riding. The sheriff returned calmly to the kitchen of the hotel. "And your mind's made up?" asked Arizona. "Yes," said the sheriff. "You go in with Sinclair." "Go in with him?" asked Arizona, baffled. "For murder," said the sheriff. "Stick up your hands, Arizona." End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Even though he was taken utterly by surprise, habit made Arizona go for his own gun as the sheriff whipped out his weapon. But under those conditions he was beaten badly to the draw. Before his weapon was half out of the holster, the sheriff had the drop. Arizona paused, but for a moment his eyes fought Kern, figuring chances. It was only the hesitation of an instant. The battle was lost before it had begun, and Arizona was clever enough to know it. Swiftly he turned on a new tack. He shoved his revolver back into the holster and smiled benevolently on the sheriff. "What's the new game, Kern?" "It ain't new," said the sheriff joylessly. "It's about the oldest game in the world, Arizona. You sure killed Sanderson." "Sanderson?" Arizona laughed. "Why, man, I ain't hardly seen him more than once. How come that I would kill him?" "Get your hands up, Arizona." "Oh, sure." He obeyed with apparent willingness. But don't let anybody see you making this fool play, Sheriff." "Maybe not so foolish. I'll tell you why you killed him. You're broke, Arizona. 10 days ago, Mississippi Slim cleaned you out at dice. Well, when Sinclair told me where Cold Feet was, you listened through the door, but you didn't stay to find out that Jig wasn't wanted no more. You beat it up to the mountain, and there you found Sanderson was ahead of your time. You drilled Sanderson, hoping to throw the blame on Cold Feet. Then you come down, but on the way Cold Feet gives you the slip and gets away, and that's why you are here." Arizona blinked. So much of this tale was true that it shook even his iron nerve. He managed to smile. "That's a wild yarn, Sheriff. Do you think it'll go down with a jury?" "It'll go down with any jury around these parts. What's more, Arizona, I ain't going to rest on what I think. I'm going to find out. And if I send down to the south inquiring about you, I got an idea that I'll find out enough to hang 10 like you, huh?" Once more Arizona received the vital blow, and he winced under the impact. Moreover, he was bewildered. His own superior intelligence had inclined him to despise the sheriff, whom he put down as a fellow of more bulldog power than mental agility. All in a moment it was being borne in upon him that he had underrated his man. He could not answer. His smooth tongue was chained. "Not that I got any personal grudge against you," went on the sheriff, "but it's gents like you that I'm after, Arizona, not ones like Sinclair. You ain't clean, Arizona. You're slick, and there ain't elbow room enough in the West for slick gents. Besides, you've got a bad way with your gun. I can tell you this, speaking private and confidential, I'm going to hang you, Arizona, if there's any way possible." He said all this quietly, but the revolver remained poised with rock-like firmness. He drew out a pair of manacles. "Stand up, Arizona." Listlessly, the fat man got up. He had been changing singularly during the last speech of the sheriff. Now he dropped a hand on the edge of the table, as if to support himself. The sheriff saw the hand grip the wood until the knuckles went white. Arizona moistened his colorless lips. "Not the irons, Sheriff," he said softly. "Not them." If it had been any other man, Kern would have imagined that he was losing his nerve. But he knew Arizona, had seen him in action, and he was certain that his courage was above question. Consequently, he was amazed. As certainly as he had ever seen them exposed, these were the horrible symptoms of cowardice that make a brave man shudder to see. "Can't trust you," he said wonderingly. "Wouldn't trust you a minute, Arizona, without the irons on you. You're a bad actor, son, and I've seen you acting up. Don't forget that." "Sheriff, I give you my word that I'll go quiet as a lamb." A moment elapsed before Kern could answer, for the voice of Arizona had trembled as he spoke. The sheriff could not believe his ears. "Well, I'm sorry, Arizona," he said more gently, because he was striving to banish this disgusting suspicion from his own mind. "I can't take no chances. Just turn around, will you, and keep them hands up." He barked the last words, for the arms of Arizona had crooked suddenly. They stiffened at the sharp command of the sheriff. Slowly trembling, as if they possessed a volition of their own, hardly controlled by the fat man, those hands fought their way back to their former position. And then Arizona gradually turned his back on the sheriff. A convulsive shudder ran through him as Kern removed his gun, and then seized one of the raised hands, drew it down, and fastened one part of the iron on it. The other hand followed, and as the sheriff snapped the lock, he saw a singular transformation in the figure of his captive. The shoulders of Arizona slouched forward. His head sank. From the erect, powerful figure of a moment before, he became, in comparison, a flabby pile of flesh, animated by no will. "What's the matter?" asked the sheriff. "You ain't lost your nerve, have you, Fatty?" Arizona did not answer. Kern stepped to one side and glanced at the face of his captive. It was strangely altered. The mouth had become trembling, loose, uncertain. The head had fallen, and the bright, keen eyes were dull. The man looked up with darting side glances. The sheriff stood back and wiped the sudden perspiration from his forehead. Under his very eyes the spirit of this gunfighter was disintegrating. The sheriff felt a cold shame pour through him. He wanted to hide this man from the eyes of others. It was not right that he should be seen. His weakness was written too patently. Kern was no psychologist, but he knew that some men out of their peculiar element are like fish out of water. He shook his head. "Walk out that back door, will you?" he asked softly. "We ain't going down the street?" demanded Arizona. "No." "Thanks, sheriff." Again Kern shuddered, swallowed, and then commanded, "Start along, Arizona." Slinking through the door, the fat man hesitated on the little porch and cast a quick glance up and down. "No one near," he said. "Hurry up, sheriff." Quickly they skirted down behind the houses, not unseen, however. A small boy playing behind his father's house raised his head to watch the hurrying pair, and when he saw the glitter of the irons, they heard him gasp. He was old enough to know the meaning of that. Irons on Arizona, who had been a town hero the night before. They saw the youngster dart around the house. "Blast him," groaned Arizona. "He'll spread it everywhere. Hurry." He was right. The sheriff hurried with a will, but as they crossed the street for the door of the jail, voices blew down to them. Looking toward the hotel, they saw men pouring out into the street, pointing, shouting to one another. They swept down on the pair. But the sheriff and his prisoner gained the door of the jail first, and Kern locked it behind him. His deputy on guard rose with a start, and at the same time there was a hurried knocking on the door and a clamor of voices without. Arizona shrank away from that sound, scowling over his shoulder, but the sheriff nodded good-humoredly. "Take it easy, Arizona. I ain't going to make a show of you." "Sure, that's like you, Sheriff," said a hurried, half-whining voice. "You're square. I'll sure show you one of these days. Now, I appreciate the way you treat me." Kern was staggered. It seemed to him that a new personality had taken possession of the body of the fat man. He led the way past his gaping deputy. The jail was not constructed for a crowd. It was merely a temporary abiding place before prisoners were taken to the larger institution at Woodville. Consequently, there was only one big cell. The sheriff unlocked the door, slipped the manacles from the wrist of Arizona, and jabbed the muzzle of a revolver into his back. The last act was decidedly necessary, for the moment his wrists were released from the grip of the steel, Arizona twitched halfway round toward the sheriff. The scrape of the gun muzzle against his ribs, however, convinced him. Over his shoulder, he cast one murderous glance at the sheriff, and then slouched forward into the cell. "Company for you, Riley," said the sheriff, as the tall cowpuncher rose. The other's back was turned, and thereby the sheriff was enabled to pass a significant gesture and look to Sinclair. With that, he left them. In the outer room, he found his deputy much alarmed. "You ain't turned them two in together?" he asked. "Why, Sinclair'd kill that gent in about a minute. Ain't it Arizona that nailed him?" "Sinclair will play square," Kern insisted, "and Arizona won't fight." Leaving the other to digest these mysterious tidings, the sheriff went out to disperse the crowd. In the meantime, Sinclair had received the newcomer in perfect silence, his head raised high, his thin mouth set in an ugly line, very much as an eagle might receive an owl which floundered by mistake onto the same crag, far above his element. The eagle hesitated between scorn of the visitor and a faint desire to pounce on him and rend him to pieces. That glittering eye, however, was soon dull with wonder when he watched the actions of Arizona. The fat man paused in the center of the cell, regarded Sinclair with a single flash of the eyes, and then glanced uneasily from side to side. That done, he slipped away to a corner and slouched down on a stool, his head bent down on his breast. Apparently, he had fallen into a profound reverie, but Sinclair found that the eyes of Arizona continually whipped up and across to him. Once the newcomer shifted his position a little, and Sinclair saw him test the weight of the stool beneath him with his hand. Even in the cell, Arizona had found a weapon. Gradually, Sinclair understood the meaning of that glance and the gesture of the sheriff as the latter left. He read other things in the gray pallor of Arizona and in the fallen head. The man was unnerved. Sinclair's reaction was very much what that of the sheriff had been, a sinking of the heart and a momentary doubt of himself. But he was something more of a philosopher than Kern. He had seen more of life and men and put two and two together. One thing stared him plainly in the face. The Arizona who skulked in the corner had relapsed 8 years. He was the same sneak thief whom Sinclair had first met in the lumber camp, and he knew instinctively that this was the first time since that unpleasant episode that Arizona had been cornered. The loathing left Sinclair, and in its place came pity. He had no fondness of Arizona, but he had seen him in the role of a strong man, which made the contrast more awful. It reminded Sinclair of the wild horse which loses its spirit when it is broken. Such was Arizona. Free to come and go, he had been a danger. Shut up helplessly in a cell, he was as feeble as a child, and his only strength was a sort of cunning malice. Sinclair turned quietly to the fat man. "Arizona," he said, "you look sort of underfed today. Bring your stool a bit nearer and let's talk. I've been hungry for a chat with someone." In reply, Arizona rolled back his head and for a moment glared thoughtfully at Sinclair. He made no answer. Presently his glance fell, like that of a dog. Sinclair shivered. He tried brutality. "Looks to me, Arizona, as though you've lost your nerve." The other moistened his lips, but said nothing. "But the point is," said the tall cowpuncher, "that you've given up before you're beaten." Riley Sinclair's words brought a flash from Arizona, a sudden lifting up of the head, as if he had not before thought of hoping. Then he began to slump back into his former position, without a reply. Sinclair followed his opening advantage at once. "What you in for?" "Murder." "Great guns! Of whom?" "Sanderson." It brought Sinclair stiffly to his feet. Sanderson? His trail was ended. Hal was avenged at last. "And you done it? Fatty, you took that job out of my hands. I'm thanking you. Besides, it ain't nothing to be downhearted about. Sanderson was a skunk. Can they prove it on you?" The need to talk overwhelmed Arizona. It burst out of him, not to Sinclair, but rather at him. His shifting eyes made sure there was no one near. "Kern is going to send south for the dope. I'm done for. They can hang me 3 times on what they'll learn, and—" "Shut up," snapped Sinclair. "Don't talk foolish. The South is a tolerable big place to send to. They don't know where you come from. Take 'em a month to find out, and by that time you won't be at hand." "Eh?" "Because you and me are going to bust out of this paper jail they've got." He had not the slightest hope of escape, but he tried the experiment of that suggestion merely to see what the fat man's reactions would be. The result was more than he could have dreamed. Arizona whirled on him with eyes ablaze. "What do you mean, Sinclair?" Just what I say. Do you think they can keep two like us in here? No, not if you come to your old self. The need to confide again fell on Arizona. He dragged the stool nearer. His voice was a whisper. Sinclair, something's busted in me. When them irons grabbed my arms, they took everything out of me. I got no chance. They got me cornered. And you'll fight like a wildcat to the end of things. Sure you will. Buck up, man. You think you've turned yellow? You ain't. You're just out of place. Take a gent that's used to a 40-foot rope and a pony. Give him 60 feet on a 16-hand horse, and ain't he out of place? Sure. He looks like a clumsy fool. And the other way around it works the same way. A trout may be a flash of light in water, but on dry land he ain't worth a damn. Same with you, Fatty. While you got a free foot, you're all right. But when they put you behind a wall and saying they're going to keep you there, you're darn near busts down. Why? Because it looks to you like you ain't got a chance to fight back. So you quit altogether. But you'll come back to yourself, Arizona. You... Arizona raised his hand. He was sitting erect now, drinking in the words of Sinclair as if they were air to a stifling man. His face worked. Why are you doing this for me, Sinclair, after I landed you here? Because I made a man out of you once, answered the tall man evenly, and I ain't going to see you backslide. Why, Arizona, you're one of the fastest thinking, quickest handed gents that ever buckled on a gun. And here you are lying down like a kid that ain't never faced trouble before. Come alive, man. You and me are going to bust this old jail to smithereens. And when we get outside, I'll blow your head off if I can. Riley's words had carried Arizona with him. Suddenly, an olive-skinned hand shot out and clutched his own bony, strong fingers. The hand was fat and cold, but it gripped that of Riley Sinclair with a desperate energy. Sinclair, you mean it? You'll play in with me? I will, sure. He had to drag the words out, but after he had spoken he was glad. New life shone in the face of Arizona. A man with you for a partner ain't done, Sinclair. Not if he had a rope around his neck. Listen, do you know why I come in town? Well, to get you out. I believe you, Arizona, lied Sinclair. Not for your sake, but hers. Sinclair's face suddenly went white. Who? The girl, whispered Arizona. I cached her away outside of town to wait for us. Sinclair, she loves you. Riley Sinclair sat as one stunned and dragged the hat from his head. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Through the branches of the copse in which she was hiding, the girl saw the sun descend in the west, a streak of slowly dropping fire, and now she became excited. As soon as it's dark, Arizona had promised, I'll make my start. Have your horse ready, be in the saddle, and the minute you see us come down that trail out of Sour Creek, be ready to feed your horse the spur and join us, because when we come, we'll come fast. Don't make no mistake. If you ride too slow, we'll have to ride slow, too. And slow riding means gunplay on both sides, and gunplay means dead men, because the evening is a pile worse nor the dark for fooling a man's aim. You'll see me and Sinclair scoot along that there road, with the gang yelling behind us. Having made this farewell speech, he waved his hand and, with a smile of confidence, jogged away from her. It was the beginning of a dull day of waiting for her, yet a day in which she dared not altogether relax her vigilance, because at any time the break might come, and Arizona might appear flying down the trail with the familiar tall form of Sinclair beside him. Wearily she waited until sundown. With the coming of dusk she wakened suddenly and became tinglingly alert. The night spread rapidly down out of the mountains. The color faded, and the sudden chill of the high altitude settled about her. Her hands and her feet were cold with the fear of excitement. Into the gathering gloom she strained her eyes. Toward Sour Creek she strained her ears, staring at every faint sound of a man's shout or the barking of a dog, as if this might be the beginning of the uproar that would announce the escape. Something swung onto the road out of the end of the main street. She was instantly in the saddle, but by the time she reached the edge of the copse, she found it to be only a wagon filled with singing men going back to some nearby ranch. Then quiet dropped over the valley, and she became aware that it was the utter dark. Arizona had failed. That knowledge grew more surely upon her with every moment. His intention must have been guessed, for she could not imagine that slippery and cold-minded fellow being thwarted, if he were left free to work as he pleased toward an object he desired. She could not stay in the grove all night. Besides, this was the critical time for Riley Sinclair. Tomorrow he would be taken to the security of the Woodville jail, and the end would be close. If anything were done for him, it must be done before morning. With the thought in mind, she rode boldly out of the trees and took the road into town, where the lights of the early evening had turned from white to yellow as the night deepened. Sour Creek was hardly a mile away when a rattling in the dark announced the approach of a buckboard. She drew rein at the side of the trail. Suddenly the wagon loomed out at her, with two down-headed horses jogging along, and the loose reins swinging above their backs. "Hello," called Jig. The brakes ground against the wheels, squeaking in protest. The horses came to a halt so willingly and suddenly that the collars shoved halfway up their necks, and the tongue of the wagon lurched beyond their noses. "Whoa! Evening there. You kind of give me a start, stranger." Parroting the dialect as well as she was able, Jig said, "Sorry, stranger. Might that be Sour Creek?" "It sure might be," said the driver, leaning through the dark to make out Jig. "New in these parts?" "Yep. I'm over from Whiteacre way, and I'm aiming for Woodville." "Whiteacre? Doggone me if it ain't good to meet a Whiteacre boy. I was raised there, son. Joe Lunids is my name." "I'm Texas Lou," said the girl. There was a subdued chuckle from the darkness. "You sound kind of young for a name like that, kid. Leastwise, your voice is tolerable young." "I'm old enough," said Jig aggressively. "Sure, sure," placated the other. "Sure you are." "Besides," she went on, "I wanted a name that I could grow up to." It brought a hearty burst of laughter from the wagon. "That's a good one, Texas. Have a drink." She set her teeth over the refusal that had come to her lips, and reining near, reached out for the flask. The driver passed over the bottle, and at the same time lighted a match for the apparent purpose of starting a cigarette. But Jiggs nodded her head in time to obscure her face with the flopping brim of her sombrero. The other coughed in his disappointment. She raised the bottle after uncorking it, firmly securing the neck with her thumb. After a moment she lowered it, and sighed with satisfaction as she had heard men do. "Thanks," said Jiggs, handing back the flask. "Hot stuff, partner." "You got a tough throat," observed the rancher. "First I ever see that didn't choke on a swig of that. But you youngsters has the advantage of a sound linings for your innards." He helped himself from the flask, coughed heavily, and then pounded home the cork. "How's things up Whiteacre way?" "Fair to middlin'," said Jig. "They ain't hollerin' for rain so much as they was." "I reckon not," agreed the rancher. "And how's things down Sour Creek way?" asked Jig. "Trouble bustin' every minute," said the other. "Murder, gun scrapes, brawls in the hotel, to beat anything I ever see. The town is sure going plumb to the dogs at this rate." "You don't say. Well, I heard something about a gent named Quade being plugged. Him, he was just the beginning, just the start. Since then, we had a man took away from old Kern, which don't happen once in a coon age. Then we had a fine fresh of murders right this morning, and the present minute they's two in jail on murder charges, and both are sure to swing." Jig gasped. "Two?" she exclaimed. "Yep. They was a skinny schoolteacher named, I forgot what. Most general he was called Cold Feet, which fitted. They thought he killed Quade on account of a girl. But a gent named Sinclair up and confessed, and he is waiting for the rope. And then a sheriff, all by himself, grabbed Arizona for the murder of Sanderson. Oh, times is picking up considerable in Sour Creek. Reminds me of 20 years back, before Kern come on the job and cleaned up the gunfighters." "Two murders?" repeated the girl faintly. "And has Arizona confessed too?" "Not him, but the sheriff has enough to give him a hard run. I've got to be drifting on, son. Take my advice and head straight for Woodville. You lack 5 years of being old enough for Sour Creek these days." He called his farewell, threw off the brake, and cursed the span of horses into their former trot. As for Jig, she waited until the scent of alkali dust died away, and the rattle of the buckboard was faint in the distance. Then she turned her horse back toward Sour Creek and urged it to a steady gallop, bouncing in the saddle. There seemed a fatality about her. On her account Sinclair had thrown his life in peril, and now Arizona was caught and held in the same danger. Enough of sacrifices for her. Her mind was firm to repay some of these services at any cost, and she had thought of a way. With that gloomy purpose before her, her ordinary timidity disappeared. It was strange to ride into Sour Creek, and she passed in review among the rough men of the town, constantly fearful that they might pierce her disguise. She had trained herself to a long stride and a swaggering demeanor, and by constant practice she had been able to lower the pitch of her voice and roughen its quality. Yet in spite of the constant practice, she never had been able to gain absolute self-confidence. Tonight, however, there was no fear in her. She went straight to the hotel, threw the reins, and walked boldly through the door into a cluster of men. They yelled at the sight of her. "Jiggs, by guns, he's come in. Say, kid, the sheriff's been looking for you." They swerved around her, grinning good-naturedly. When a person has been almost lynched for a crime another has committed, he gains a certain standing, no matter what may be the public opinion of his courage. The schoolteacher had become a personage, but Jig met their smiles with a level eye. "If the sheriff's looking for me," she said, "tell him I have a room in the hotel. He can find me here." Pop shook hands before he shoved the register toward her. "My kids will sure be glad to see you safe back," he said. "And I'm glad too, Jig." Nodding, she turned to sign her name in the bold, free hand which she had cultivated. She could feel the crowd staring behind her, and she could hear their murmurs. But she was not nervous. It seemed that all apprehension had left her. "Where's Cartwright?" she asked. "Sitting in a game of poker." "Hello, buddy," she called to a red-headed youngster. "Go in and tell Cartwright that I'm waiting for him in my room, will you?" "Ain't no use," said Pop, staring at this new and more masculine Jig. "Cartwright is all heated up about the game, and he's lost enough to get anybody excited. He won't come. Better go in there if you want to see him." "I'll try my luck this way," said Jig coldly. "Run along, Buddy." Buddy obeyed, and Jig went up the stairs to her room. "What's come over him?" asked the crowd, the moment Cold Feet was out of sight. "Looks like he growed up in a day." "He's gone through enough to make a man out of him," answered Pop. "Never can tell how a kid will turn out." But in her room Jig had sunk into a chair, dropped her elbows on the table, and buried her face in her hands, trying to steady her thoughts. She heard the heavy pounding of feet on the stairs, a strong tread in the hall that made the flooring of the old building quiver, and then the door was flung open, slammed shut, and the key turned in the lock. Cartwright set his shoulders against the door, as though he feared she would try to rush past him. He stared at her with a queer mixture of fear, rage, and astonishment. "So I've got you at last, huh? I got you after all this." Curiously, she stared at him. She had dreaded the interview, but now that he was before her, she was surprised to find that she felt no fear. She examined him as if from a distance. "Yes," she admitted, "you have me. Will you sit down?" "I need room to talk," he said, swaggering to the table. He struck his fist on it. "Now, to start with, what in thunder did you mean by running away?" "We're leaving the past to bury the past," she said. "That's the first concession you have to make." He laughed, his laughter ending with a choked sound. "And why should I make concessions?" Jiggs watched the veins of fury swell in his forehead, watched calmly, and then threw her sombrero on the bed and smoothed back her hair, still watching without a change of expression. It seemed as if her calm acted to sober him, and the passing of her hand across the bright silken hair all at once softened him. He sank into the opposite chair, leaning far across the table toward her. "Honey, take you all in all, you're prettier right here in this man's outfit than I ever see you. A pile prettier." For a moment she closed her eyes. The sacrifice which she intended was becoming harder, desperately hard to make. "I'm going to take you back and forgive you," said Cartwright, apparently blind to what was going on in her mind. "I ain't one to carry malice. You keep to the line from now on, and we'll get along fine. But you step crooked just once more, and I'll learn you a pile of things you never even dreamed could happen." To her it seemed that he stood in a shaft of consuming light that exposed every shadowy nook and cranny of his nature, and the narrow-minded meanness that she saw startled her. "What you do afterward with me is your own affair," she said. "It's about the present that I've come to bargain." "Bargain?" "Exactly. Do what I ask, and I go back and act as your wife. If you refuse, I walk out of your life forever." He could not speak for a moment. Then he exploded. "It's funny. I could almost laugh hearing you chatter crazy like this. Don't you think I've got a right to make my own wife come home with me? Now that I've found her, wouldn't the law stand behind me?" "You can force me to come," she admitted quietly. "But if you do, I'll let the whole truth be known that I ran away from you. Can your pride stand that, Jude?" He writhed. "And how you'll get around that, even if I don't make you, and you come back of your own free will?" "Somehow I'll manage. I'll find a story of how I was carried away by half a dozen men who had come to loot the upper rooms of the house, while the wedding party was downstairs. I'll find a story that will wash." "Yes, I think you will," said Cartwright, breathing heavily. "I sure think you will. You was always a clever little devil, I know. But a bargain? I ought to—" He checked himself. "But I'm through with the black talk. When I get you back on the ranch, I'll show you that you can be happy up there. And now when you get over your fool notions, you'll be a wife to be proud of. Now, honey, tell me what you want." "I want you to save the lives of two men. They're both in jail on my account, and they're both charged with murder. You know who I mean." Cartwright rose out of his chair. "Sinclair," he groaned. "Curse him. Sinclair again, huh? What's they between you two?" Her answer smothered his fury again. It was pain that was giving her strength. "Jude, If you really want me to go back with you, don't ask that question. He has treated me as an honorable man always treats a woman. He tried to serve me." "Serve you? By coming here trying to kill me?" "He may have thought I wished to be free. He didn't tell me what he was going to do." "That's a lie." He stopped, watching her white face. "I don't mean that, you know. But you ain't actually asking me to get Sinclair out of jail. Besides, I couldn't do it." "You could easily. Moreover, it is to your interest. It will take a strong jail to hold him, and if he breaks away, you know that he's a dangerous man. He hates you, Jude, and he might try to find you. If he did." She waved her hand, and Cartwright followed the gesture with great fascinated eyes, as if he saw himself dissolving into thin air. "I know he's a desperado right enough, the Sinclair. Ain't I seen him work?" He shuddered at the memory. "But get him out of jail, Jude, and that will be ended. He'll be your friend." "Could I trust him?" "Don't you think Riley Sinclair is a man to be trusted?" "I don't know." He lowered his eyes. "Maybe he is." "As for Arizona," she went on, "the same thing holds for him." "Yes, if I could get one out, I could get two. But how can I do it? This Sheriff Kern is a fighting idiot, and loves a gunplay. Ain't no man killer, honey." "But you're rich, Jude." "Tolerable. There may be one or two has more than me around these parts." "And money buys men." "Don't it, though?" said Jude, expanding. "Why, when they found out that I was a spender, they started in hounding me. One gent wanted me to help him on a mortgage, only $50 to meet a payment. And they's half a dozen would mortgage their souls if I'd stake 'em to enough downstairs to get 'em into a crap game or something." "Then let them have the money they need. Why, it wouldn't be more than $100 altogether." "100 is 100. Why should I throw it away on them bums?" "Because after you've done it, you'll have a dozen men who'll follow you. You'll have a mob." "Sure, but what of that? Expect me to lead an attack on a jail, huh? Throw my life away. By guns, I think you'd like that." "You don't have to lead. Just give them the money they need, and then spread the word around that Riley Sinclair is really an honorable man who killed Quade in a fair fight. I know what they thought of Quade. He was a bully. No one liked him. Tell them it's a shame that a man like Sinclair should die because he killed a big, hulking cur such as Quade. They'll listen, particularly if they have your money. I know these men, Jude. If they think an injustice is being done, they'll risk their necks to right it. And if you work on them in the right way, you can have 20 men who'll risk everything to get Riley out. But there won't be a risk. If 20 men rush the jail, the guards will simply throw down their guns and give up." "Well, I wonder," muttered Cartwright. "I'm sure of it, Jude. Do you think a deputy will let himself be killed simply to keep a prisoner safely? They won't do it." "You don't know this Kern." "I do know him, and I know that he's human. I've seen him beaten once already." "By Sinclair. You keep coming back to him." "Jude, if you do this thing for me," she said steadily, "I'll go back with you. I don't love you, but if I go back, I'll keep you from a great deal of shameful talk. I'm sorry, truly, that I left. I couldn't help it. It was an impulse that took me by the throat. And if I go back, I'll honestly try to make you a good wife." She faltered a little before that last word, and her voice fell. But Jude Cartwright was wholly fascinated by the color in her face, and the softness of her voice he mistook for a sudden rise of tenderness. "They's only one thing I got to ask. You and Sinclair, have you ever have you ever told him you're pretty fond of him? That you love him?" He blurted it out, stammering. Certainly she knew that her answer was a lie, though it was true in the letter. "I never told him so," she said firmly, "but I owe him a great debt. He must not die because he's a gentleman, Jude." All the time she was speaking he watched her with ferret sharpness, thinking busily. Before she ended, he had reached his decision. "I'm going to raise that mob." "Jude!" What a ring in her voice! If he had been in doubt, he would have known then. No matter what she said, she loved Riley Sinclair. He smiled sourly down on her. "Keep your thanks. You'll hear news of Sinclair before morning." And he stalked out of the room. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cartwright went downstairs in the highest good humor. He had been convinced of two things in the interview with his wife. The first was that she could be induced to return to him. The second was that she loved Riley Sinclair. He did not hate her for such fickleness. He merely despised her for her lack of brains. No thinking woman could hesitate a moment between the ranches and the lumber tracts of Cartwright and the empty purse of Riley Sinclair. As for hatred, that he concentrated on the head of Sinclair himself. He had already excellent reasons for hating the rangy cowpuncher. Those reasons were now intensified and given weight by what he had recently learned. He determined to raise a mob, but not to accomplish his wife's desires. What she had said about the weakness of jails, the strength of Sinclair, and the probability that once out he would take the trail of the rancher appealed vigorously to his imagination. He did not dream that such a man as Sinclair would hesitate at a killing. And loving the girl, the first thing Sinclair would do would be to remove the obstacle through the simple expedient of a well-placed bullet. But the girl had not only convinced him in this direction, she had taught him where his strength lay, and she had pointed a novel use for that strength. He went to work instantly when he entered the big back room of the hotel, which was used for cards and surreptitious drinking. A little, patient-faced man in a corner, who had been sucking a pipe all evening and watching the crap game hungrily, was the first object of his charity. $10 slipped into the pocket of the little cowpuncher brought him out of his chair with a grin of gratitude and bewilderment. A moment later he was on his knees calling to the dice in a crackling voice. Crossing the room, Cartwright picked out two more obviously stalled gamblers and gave them a new start. Returning to the table, he found that the game was lagging. In the first place, he had from the start supplied most of the sinews of war to that game. Also, two disgruntled members had gone broke in his absence, through trying to plunge for the spoils of the evening. They sat back with black faces and watched him come. "We're getting down to a small game," said the gray-headed man who was dealing. But Cartwright had other ideas. "A friend's a friend," he said jovially, "and a gent that's been playing beside me all evening I figure for a friend. Sit in, boys. I'll stake you to a couple of rounds, huh?" Gladly they came, astonished and exchanging glances. Cartwright had made a sour loser all the game. This sudden generosity took them off balance. It let in a merciful light upon the cruel criticism which they had been leveling at him in private. The pale man with the blond eyelashes and the faded blue eyes, who had been dexterously stacking the cards all through the game, decided at that moment that he would not only stop cheating, but he would even lose some of his ill-gotten gains back into the game. Only a sudden rush of unbelievable luck kept him from executing his generous and silent promise. This pale-faced man was named Whitey, from the excessive blondness of his hair and his pallor. He was not popular in Sour Creek, but he was much respected. A proof of his ingenuity was that he had cheated at cards in that community for 5 years, and still he had never been caught at his work. He was not a bold-talking man. In fact, he never started arguments or trouble of any kind. But he was a most dexterous and thorough-going fighter when he was cornered. In fact, he was what is known widely as a finisher. And it was Whitey whom Cartwright had chosen as the leader of the mob which he intended raising. He waited until the first shuffle was in progress after the hand. Then he began his theme. "Understand the sheriff is pretty strong for this Sinclair that murdered Quade," he said carelessly. "Murder is a tolerable strong word," came back the unfriendly answer. "Maybe it was a fair fight." Cartwright laughed. "Maybe it was," he said. Whitey interrupted himself in the act of shoving the pack across to be cut. He raised his pale eyes to the face of the rancher. "What makes you laugh, Cartwright?" "Nothing," said Jude hastily. "Nothing at all. If you gents don't know Sinclair, it ain't up to me to give you light. Let him go." Nothing more was said during that hand which Whitey won. Jude, apparently bluffing shamelessly, bucked him up to $50, and then he allowed himself to be called with a pair of tens against a full house. Not only did he lose, but he started a laugh against himself, and he joined in cheerfully. He was aware of Whitey frowning curiously at him and smiling faintly, which was the nearest that Whitey ever came to laughter. And indeed, the laugh cost Cartwright more than money, but it was a price, the price he was paying for the adherence of Whitey. "What about the Sinclair?" asked the man, with the great red blotchy freckles across his face and the back of his neck, so that the skin between looked red and raw. "You come from up north, which is his direction, too. Know anything about him?" "He looks like pretty much of a man to me, and the sheriff says he's a square shooter from the word go." "Maybe he is," said Cartwright, "but I don't want to go around digging the ground away from nobody's reputation." "Whatever he's got, he won't last long," said Whitey definitely. "He'll swing sure." It was Cartwright's opening. He took advantage of it dexterously, without too much haste. He even yawned to show his lack of interest. "Well, I got 100 that says he don't hang," he observed quietly, and looked full at Whitey across the table. It was a challenge which the gambling spirit of the latter could not afford to overlook. "Money talks," began Whitey. Then he checked himself. "Do you know anything, Cartwright?" "Sure I don't," said Jude, in the manner of one who has abundant knowledge in reserve. "But they say that the sheriff and Sinclair have become regular bunkies. Don't do nothing hardly but sit and chin with each other over in the jail. Ever known Kern to do that before?" They shook their heads. "Which is a sign that Sinclair may be all right," said the sober Whitey. "Which is a sign that he might have something on the sheriff," said Jude Cartwright. "I don't say that he has, mind you, but it looks kind of queer. He yanked a prisoner away from the sheriff one day, and the next day he's took for murder. Did the sheriff have much to do with his taking? No, he didn't. By all accounts, it was Arizona that done the taking, planning, and everything. And after Sinclair is took, what does the sheriff do? He gets on the trail of Arizona and has him checked in for murder of another gent. Maybe Arizona is guilty, maybe he ain't, but it kind of looks if they was something between Sinclair and Kern, don't it?" At this bold exposition of possibilities they paused. "Kern is figured tolerable straight," declared Whitey. "Sure he is. That's because he don't talk none and does his work. Besides, he's a killer. That's his job. So is Sinclair a killer. Maybe he did fight Quade square, but Quade ain't the only one. Why, boys, the Sinclair has got a record as long as my arm." In silence they sat around the table, each man thinking hard. The professional gunmen get scant sympathy from ordinary cowpunchers. "Now I dropped in at the jail," said the man of the great freckles, "and come to think about it, I heard Sinclair singing, and I seen him polishing his spurs." "Sure, he's getting ready for a ride," put in Cartwright. There was a growl from the others. They were slowly turning their interest from the game to Cartwright. "What do you mean, a ride?" "Got another 100," said Cartwright calmly, "that when the morning comes it won't find Sinclair in the jail." At once they were absolutely silenced, for money talks in an eloquent voice. Deliberately Cartwright counted out the 2 stacks of shimmering $20 gold pieces, 5 to a stack. 100 that he don't hang, and another 100 that he ain't in the jail when the morning comes. Any takers, boys? It ought to be easy money if everything's square." Whitey made a move, but finally merely raised his hand and rubbed his chin. He was watching that gold on the table with cat-like interest. A man must know something to be so sure. "I'd like to know," murmured the man of the freckles disconnectedly. "Well," said Cartwright, "there ain't much of a mystery about it. For one thing, if the sheriff was plumb set on keeping them 2, why didn't he take 'em over to Woodville today, where there's a jail they couldn't bust out of, eh?" Again they were silenced, and in an argument, when a man falls silent, it simply means that he is thinking hard on the other side. "But as far as I'm concerned," went on Cartwright, yawning again, "it don't make no difference one way or another. Sour Creek ain't my town, and I don't care if it gets the ha-ha for having its jail busted open. Of course, after the birds have flown, the sheriff will ride hard after 'em on the wrong trail." Whitey raised his slender, agile, efficient hand. "Gents," he said, "something has got to be done. This man Cartwright is giving us the truth. He's got his hunch, and hunches is mostly always right." "Speak out, Whitey," said the man with the freckles encouragingly. "I like your style of thinking." Nodding his acknowledgments, Whitey said, "The main thing seems to be that Sinclair and Arizona is old hands at killing, and they had ought to be hung. Well, if the sheriff ain't got the rope, maybe we could help him out, huh?" End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The moment her husband was gone, Jig dropped back in her chair and buried her face in her arms, weeping. But there is a sort of sad happiness in making sacrifices for those we love, and presently Jig was laughing through her tears and trembling as she wiped the tears away. After a time she was able to make herself ready for another appearance in the street of Sour Creek. She practiced back and forth in her room that exaggerated swagger, jerked her sombrero rakishly over one eye, cocked up her cartridge belt at one side, and swung down the stairs. She went straight to the jail and met the sheriff at the door, where he sat smoking a stub of a pipe. He gaped widely at the sight of her, smoke streaming up past his eyes. Then he rose and shook hands violently. "All I got to say, Jig," he remarked, "is that the others was the ones that made the big mistake. When I went and arrested you, I was just following in line, but I'm sorry, and I'm mighty glad that you've been found to be okay." Wanly she smiled and thanked him for his good wishes. "I'd like to see Sinclair," she said. Kern's amiability increased. "The best thing I know about you, Jig, is that you ain't turning Sinclair down, now that he's in trouble. Go right back into jail. Him and Arizona is chinning. Wait a minute. I guess I got to keep an eye on you to see you don't pass nothing through the bars. Keep clean back from them bars, Jig, and then you can talk all you want. I'll stay here where I can watch you, but can't hear. Is that square?" "Nothing squarer in the world," said Jig, and went in. She left the sheriff grinning vacantly into the dark. There was a peculiar something in Jig's smile that softened men. But when she stepped into the sphere of the lantern light that spread faintly through the cell, she was astonished to see Arizona and Sinclair kneeling opposite each other, shooting dice with abandon and snapping of the fingers. They rose, laughing at the sight of her, and came to the bars. "But you aren't worried?" asked Jig. "You aren't upset by all this?" It was Arizona who answered, a strangely changed Arizona since his entrance into the jail. "Look here," he said gaily, "why should we be worrying? Ain't we got a good sound roof over our heads, with a set of blankets to sleep in?" He smiled at tall Sinclair, then changed his voice. "Things fell through," he said softly, glancing at the far-off shadowy figure of the sheriff. "Sorry, but we'll work this out yet." "I know," she answered. She lowered her voice to caution. "I'm only going to stay a moment to keep away suspicions. Listen, something is going to happen tonight that will set you both free. Don't ask me what it is, but among those cottonwoods behind the blacksmith shop I'm going to have 2 good horses saddled and ready for you. One will be your roan, Arizona, and I'll have a good horse for you, Riley. And when you're free, start for those horses." Sinclair laid hold on the bars with his big hands and pressed his face close to the iron, staring at her. "You ain't coming along with us?" he asked. "I? No." "Are you going to stay here?" "Perhaps. I don't know. I haven't made up my mind." "Has Cartwright?" She broke away from those entangling questions. "I must go." "But you'll be at the place with the horses?" "Yes." "Then so long till the time comes. And you're a brick, Jig." Once outside the jail, she set to work at once. As for getting the roan, it was the simplest thing in the world. There was no one in the stable behind the hotel, and no one to ask questions. She calmly saddled the roan, mounted him, and rode by a wider detour to the cottonwoods behind the blacksmith shop. Her own horse was to be for Sinclair, but before she took him, she went into the hotel, and the first man she found on the veranda was Cartwright. He came to her at once, shifting away from the others. "How are things?" "Good," said Cartwright. "Ain't you heard 'em talking?" Here and there about the hotel, men stood in knots of 3 or 4, talking in low voices. "Are they talking about that?" "Sure they are," said Cartwright, relieved. "You ain't heard nothing?" "Not a word." "Then the thing for you to do is to keep under cover. You don't want to get mixed up in this thing, eh?" "I suppose not." "Keep out of sight, honey. The crowd will start pretty soon and tear things loose." He could not resist one savage thrust. "A rope or a pair of ropes will do the work." "Ropes?" "One to tie Kern and the other to tie his deputy," he explained smoothly. "Where are you going now?" "Getting their retreat ready," she whispered excitedly. "I've already warned them where to go to get the horses." She waved to him and stepped back into the night, convinced that all was well. As for Cartwright, he hesitated, staring after her. After all, if his plan developed, it would be wise for him to allow the others to do the work of mischief. He had no wish to be actively mixed up with a lynching party. Sometimes there were after results, and if he had done no more than talk, there would be small hold upon him by the law. Moreover, things were going smoothly under the guidance of Whitey. The pale-faced man had thrown himself body and soul into the movement. It was a rare thing to see Whitey excited. Other men were readily impressed. After a time, when anger had reached a certain point where men melt into hot action, these fixed figures of men would sweep into fluid action, and then the fates of Arizona and Sinclair would be determined. It pleased Cartwright more than any action of his life to feel that he had stirred up this movement. It pleased him still more to know that he could now step back and watch the work of ruin go on. It was like disturbing the one small stone which starts the avalanche, which eventually smashes the far-off forest. So much was done then, and now why not make sure that the very last means of retreat for the pair was blocked? The girl went to get the horses, and if, by the 1 chance in 20, the two should actually break out of the jail, it would remain to Cartwright to kill the horses or the men. He did not care which. He slipped behind the hotel and presently saw the girl come out of the stable with her horse. He followed, skulking softly behind her until he reached the appointed place among the cottonwoods. The trees grew tall and thick of trunk, and about their bases was a growth of dense shrubbery. It was a simple thing to conceal two saddled horses in a hollow which sank into the edge of the shrubbery. Cartwright's first desire was to couch himself in shooting distance. Then he remembered that shooting with a revolver by moonlight was uncertain work. He slipped away to the hotel and got a rifle ready enough. Men were milling through the lower rooms of the hotel. The point of discussion had long since been passed. The ringleaders had made up their minds. They went about with faces so black that those who were asked to join hardly had the courage to question. There was broad-voiced rumor growing swiftly. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. It was like that mysterious whisper which goes through the forest before the heavy storm strikes. Something was terribly wrong and must be righted. How the ringleaders had reasoned, nobody paused to ask. It was sufficient that a score of men were saying, "The sheriff figures on letting Sinclair and Arizona go." A typical scene between two men. They meet casually, one man whistling, the other thoughtful. "What's the bad luck?" asked the whistler. "No time for whistling," says the other. "Say, what do you mean?" "I ask you just this," said the gloomy man, with a mystery of much knowledge in his face. "Are gents around here going to be murdered, and the murderers go free?" "Well?" "Sinclair and Arizona, that's what's up. They're going to bust loose." "I don't know about Arizona, but Sinclair, they say, is a square shooter." "Who told you that? Sinclair himself? He's got a rep as long as my arm. He's a bad one, son." "You don't say?" "I do say, and something has got to be done, or Sour Creek won't be a decent man's town no more." "Let me in." Off they went, arm in arm. Cartwright saw half a dozen little interviews of this nature as he entered the hotel. Men were excited, they hardly knew why. There is no need for reason in a mob. One has only to cry "kill," and the mob will start of its own volition to find something that may be slain. Also, a mob has no conscience and no remorse. It is the nearest thing to a devil that exists, and it is also the nearest thing to the divine mercy and courage. It is braver than the bravest man. It is more timorous than the most fearful. It is fiercer than a lion, gentler than a lamb. All these things by turn, and each one to the exclusion of all the others. Now the thunderclouds were piling on the horizon, and Cartwright could feel the electricity in the air. He went to Pop. "I gotta have a rifle." "What for?" "You know," said Cartwright significantly. The hotel keeper nodded. He brought out an old Winchester, still mobile of action and deadly. With that weapon under his arm, Cartwright started back, but then he remembered that there were excellent chances of missing even with a rifle, when he was shooting through the shadows and by the treacherous moonlight. It would be better, far better, to have his horse with him. Then if he actually succeeded in wounding one or both of them, he could run his victim down, or perhaps keep up a steady fire of rifle shots from the rear that would bring half the town pouring out to join in the chase. So he swung back to the stables, saddled his horse, trotted it around in a comfortably wide detour, and coming within sound distance of the cottonwoods behind the blacksmith's shop, he dismounted and led his horse into a dense growth of shrubbery. That close approach would have been impossible without alarming the girl, had it not been for a stiff wind blowing across into his face, completely muffling the noise of his coming. In the bushes he ensconced himself safely. Only a few yards away he kept his eye on the opening among the cottonwoods, behind which the girl and the two horses moved from time to time, growing more and more visible as the moon climbed above the horizon mist. He tightened his grip on the rifle and amused himself with drawing beads on stumps and bright bits of foliage. From time to time he must be ready for any sort of action if the two should ever appear. While he waited, sounds reached his ear from the town, sounds eloquent of purpose. He listened to them as to beautiful music. It was a low, distinct, and continuous humming sound. Voices of men went into it, low as the growl of an angered dog, and there was a background of slamming doors and footsteps on verandas. Sour Creek was mustering for the assault. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of the Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Now that sound had entered the jail, and it had a peculiar effect. It was like that distant murmuring of the storm which walks over the treetops far away. It made the sheriff and his two prisoners lift their heads and look at one another in silence. For the sheriff was most unprofessionally tilted back in a chair, with his feet braced against the bars of the cell, while he chatted with his bad men about men, women, and events. The sheriff had a distinct curiosity to learn how Arizona had recovered so suddenly from his blue funk. Unquestionably, the fat man had recovered. His voice was as steady now as any man's, and the old insolent glitter was in his eyes. He squared his shoulders and blew his smoke straight at the face of the sheriff as he talked. What caused it, the sheriff could not tell, this rehabilitation of a fighting man, but he connected the influence of Sinclair with the change. By this time Sinclair himself was the more restless of the two. While Arizona sat on ease on the bunk, the tall man ranged up and down the cell with long, noiseless steps, turning quickly back and forth besides the bars. He had spent his nervous energy cheering up Arizona until the latter was filled with a reckless, careless courage. What would happen Arizona could not guess, but Sinclair had assured him that something would happen, and he trusted implicitly to the word of his tall companion. Sooner or later he would learn that they were hopeless, and Sinclair dreaded the breakdown which he knew would follow that discovery. In his heart, Sinclair knew that there would be no hope, no chance. The girl, he felt, had been swept off her feet with some absurd dream of freeing them. For his own part, he had implicit faith in the strength of the tool-proof steel of the bars, on the one hand, and the gun of the sheriff on the other. As long as they held, they would keep their prisoners. The key to freedom was the key to the sheriff's heart, and Sinclair was too much of a man to whine. He had come to the end of his trail, and that was evident in the restlessness of his walking to and fro. The love of the one thing on earth that he cared for was his, according to Arizona, and there was nothing to make the fat man lie. It seemed to Riley Sinclair that, at the very moment he had set his hands upon priceless gold, the treasure was crumbling to dead sand. He had lost her by the very thing that won her. In the midst of his pacing he stopped and lifted his head, just as the sheriff and Arizona did the same thing. The far-off murmur hummed and moaned toward them, gathering strength. Then the sheriff pushed back his chair and went to the front of the jail. They heard him give directions to his deputy to find out what the murmuring meant. When Kern returned, he was patently worried. "Gents," he said, "I've heard that same sort of sound twice before, and it means business." None of the three spoke again until the door of the jail was burst open and the deputy came on them, running. "Kern," he gasped as he reached the sheriff, "they're coming." "Who?" "Every man in Sour Creek. They tried to get me with 'em. I told 'em I'd stay, and then slipped off. They want both of these. They want 'em bad. They're going to fight to get 'em." "Do they want to grab Arizona and Sinclair?" asked the sheriff, with surprising lack of emotion. "Don't think they're guilty?" "You're wrong. They think they're sure guilty, and they're going to lynch 'em." He whispered this, but his panting made the words louder than he thought. Sinclair heard, and by the shudder of Arizona, he knew that his companion had heard as well. Now came the low-pitched voice of the sheriff. "Are you with me, Pat?" The deputy receded. "Why, man, you ain't going to fight the whole town." "I'd fight the whole town," said the sheriff smoothly, "but I don't need you with me. You're through, partner. Close the door soft when you go out." Pat made no argument, offering no sentimental protest of devotion. He was glad of any excuse, and he retreated at once. After him went the sheriff, and Sinclair heard the heavy door of the jail locked. Kern came back carrying a bundle. Outside, the murmuring had increased at a single leap to a roar. The rush for the jail was beginning. Arizona shrank back against the wall, his little eyes glaring desperately at Sinclair, his last hope in the emergency. But Sinclair looked to the sheriff. The bundle in the arms of the latter unrolled and showed 2 cartridge belts with guns appended. Next, still in silence, the sheriff unlocked the door to the cell. "Sinclair?" The tall cowpuncher leaped beside him. Arizona skirted away to one side stealthily. "None of that," commanded Kern. "No crooked work, Arizona. I'm giving you a fighting chance for your lives." He tossed a gun and a belt to Sinclair. The latter, without a word, buckled it on. "Now, quick work, boys," said the sheriff. "It's going to be the second time in my life that prisoners have got away and tied me up. Understand? There ain't going to be no massacre if I can help it. Gents like Sinclair don't come in pairs, and he's going to have a fighting chance. Boys, tie me up fast and throw me in the corner. I'll tell 'em that you slugged me through the bars and got the keys away. You hear?" As he spoke, he threw Arizona a gun and a belt, and the latter imitated Sinclair in buckling it on. But the fat man then made for the door of the cell. Outside, the rush reached the entrance to the jail and split on it. The voices leaped into a tumult. "By thunder," demanded Arizona, "are you going to wait for that?" "You want Kern to get into trouble?" asked Sinclair. "Grab this end and tie his ankles while I fix his hands." Frantically, they worked together. "Are you comfortable, Sheriff?" He lay securely trussed in a corner of the passageway. "Dead easy, boys. Now, what's your plan?" "Is there a back way out?" "No way in or out but the front door. But you got to wait till they smash it. There, they start now. Then dive out as they rush. They won't be expecting nothing like that. But gag me first." Hastily, Sinclair obeyed. The door of the jail was shaking and groaning under the attack from without, and the shouts were a steady roar. Then he hurried to the front of the little building. Arizona was already there, gun in hand, watching the door bulge under the impact. Evidently, they had caught up a heavy timber, and a dozen men were pounding it against the massive door. Sinclair caught the gun arm of his companion. "Fatty," he said hastily, "gunplay will spoil everything. We've got to take 'em by surprise. Fast running will save us, maybe. Fast shooting ain't any good when it's one man against 50, and these boys mean business." Arizona reluctantly let his gun drop back into its holster. He nodded to Sinclair. The latter gave his directions swiftly, speaking loudly to make his voice carry over the roar of the crowd. "When the door goes down, which it'll do pretty pronto, I'll dive out from this side, and you run from the other side, straight into the crowd. I'll turn to the right, and you turn to the left. The minute you're around the corner of the building, shoot back over your shoulder or straight into the air. It'll make 'em think that you've stopped and are going to fight 'em off from the corner. They'll take it slow, you can bet, then beat it straight on for the cottonwoods behind the blacksmith shop. They'll drop us the minute we show. Sure, we got the long chance and nothing more. Is that good enough for you?" He was rewarded in the dimness by a glint in the eyes of Arizona, and then the fat man gripped his hand. "You and me against the world." In the meantime, the door was bulging in the center under the blows of increasing weight. A second battering ram was now brought into play, and the rain of blows was unceasing. Still between the shocks, the door sprang back, but there was a telltale rattle at every blow. Finally, as a yell sprang up from the crowd at the sight, the upper hinge snapped loudly, and the door sagged in. Both timbers were now apparently swung at the same moment. Under the joint impact, the door was literally lifted from its last hinge and hurled inward, and with it lunged the two battering rams and the men who had wielded them. They tumbled headlong, carried away by the very weight of their successful blow. "Now," called Sinclair, and he sprang with an Indian yell over the heads of the sprawling men in the doorway and into the thick of the crowd. Half a dozen of the drawn guns whipped up at the sight, but no one could make sure in the half-light of the identity of the man who had dashed out. Their imaginations placed the two prisoners safely behind the bars inside. Before they could think twice, a second figure leaped through the doorway and passed them in the opposite direction. Then they awakened to the fact, but they awakened in confusion. A dozen shots blazed in either direction, but they were wild snapshots of men taken off balance. Two leaps took Sinclair through the thick of the astonished men before him. He came to the scattering edges and saw a man dive at him. The cowpuncher beat the butt of his gun into the latter's face and sped on, whipping around the corner of the little jail with bullets whistling after him. His own gun, as he leaped out of sight, he fired into the ground, and he heard a similar shot from the far side of the building. Those two shots, as he had predicted, checked the pursuers one vital second and kept them milling in front of the jail. Then they spilled out around the corners, each man running low, his gun ready. But Sinclair, deep in the darkness of the tree shadows behind the jail, was already out of sight. He caught a glimpse of Arizona sprinting ahead of him for dear life. They reached the cottonwoods together and were greeted by a low shout from the girl. She was running out from the shelter, dragging the horses after her. Arizona went into his saddle with a single leap. Sinclair paused to take the jump. With his hand on the pommel, and as he lifted himself up with a jump, a gun blazed in point-blank range from the nearest shrubbery. There was a yell from Arizona, not of pain, but of rage. They saw his gun glisten in his hand, and swerving his horse to disturb the aim of the marksman, his weapon's first report blended with the second shot from the bushes, a tongue of darting flame. Straight at the flash of a target Arizona had fired, and there was an answering yell. Out of the dark of the shrubbery a great form leaped, with a grotesque shadow beneath it on the moon-whitened ground. "Cartwright!" cried Sinclair, as the big man collapsed and became a shapeless, inanimate black heap. Straight ahead Arizona was already spurring, and Sinclair waved once to the white face of Jig, then shot after his companion, while the trees and shrubbery to their left emitted a sudden swarm of men and barking guns. But to strike a rapidly moving object with a revolver is never easy, and to strike by the moonlight is difficult indeed. A dangerous flight of slugs bored the air around the fugitives for the first 100 yards of their flight, but after that the firing ceased as the men of Sour Creek ran for their horses. Straight on into the night rode the pair. 1 year had made Arizona a little plumper, and 1 year had drawn Riley Sinclair more lean and somber. When they rode out on the shoulder of a flat-topped mountain and looked down into the hollow, where the late afternoon sun was already sending broad shadows out from every rise of ground, Sour Creek was a blur and a twinkle of glass in the distance. "Come to think of it," said Arizona, "it was just 1 year today, Riley. Was it that brung you back here, and me unknowing?" The tall man made no answer, but shaded his eyes to peer down into the valley, and Arizona made no attempt to pursue the conversation. He was long since accustomed to the silences of his traveling mate. Seeing that Sinclair showed no disposition either to speak or move, he left the big cowpuncher to himself and started off through the trees in search of game. The sign of a deer caught his eye and hurried him on into a futile chase, from which he returned in the early dark of the evening. He was guided by the fire which Sinclair had kindled on the shoulder, but to his surprise, as he drew nearer, the fire dwindled, very much as if Riley had entirely forgotten to replenish it with dry wood. A year of wild life had sharpened the caution of Arizona. That neglect of his fire was by no means in keeping with the usual methods of Sinclair. Before he came to the last spur of the hill, Arizona dismounted and stole up on foot. He listened intently. There was not a sound of anyone moving about. There was only an occasional crackle of the dying fire. When he came to the edge of the shoulder, Arizona raised his head cautiously to peer over. He saw a faintly illumined picture of Riley Sinclair, sitting with his hat off, his face raised, and such a light in his face that there needed no play of the fire to tell its meaning. Beside him sat a girl, more distinct, for she was dressed in white, and the fire gleamed and curled and mottled her hair, and cast a highlight on her chin, her throat, and her hand in the brown hand of Sinclair. Arizona winced down out of sight and stole back under the trees. "Doggone me," he said to his horse. They both remembered the day. End of chapter 35. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Rangeland Avenger by Max Brand.